Okay, we did get a lot more RSVPs this week than last week, but we'll see if the follow through is the usual 25%. Welcome, everyone. Some of you have been here last week, and some of you, yeah, but some of you are new, and that's okay. Welcome. Glad to see you here, and I'm sure more people will be trickling in. We're doing Kenneth Smith. Yeah, there's Carl. Carl was here last week. We're doing Kenneth Smith. We had such a great time last week that we wanted to keep this going. And let's see if my internet connection stays around this time. That would be great, so I can actually come to the end. I cut out my whole Time Warner connection cut out last week. Cable television, telephone, landline. We still have a landline and internet for 5 hours. It was down. So I'm really sorry I had to miss the end, but I understand it was pretty good. So we hope we can. I can stick around here. But you all agreed, yeah, let's keep going. There's a lot of Smith to cover. I mean, he's one of my favorites. If you've talked to me for any length of time, you know that already. And probably we'll never run out. If we do one essay a week, we'd be going for the next 10 years. And I'm not kidding. Yeah, Rick knows. But I have wondered and thought about, how do you present Kenneth Smith to newcomers? It's very difficult. It's not as easy as others would think it would be, because there's no one central place to go. There's no book, actually. I mean, he's written books, but I don't think they're a good place to start. There is no good place to start. That's the problem. There's really no good place to start. You just have to dive in and fumble around and see where you get. So this is going to be really largely experimental, and mistakes are going to be made, and I beg your indulgence. But luckily, with the thing, when I was doing a month ago, we did a presentation on Hannah Arendt, and I got an expert on Hannah Arendt to do that presentation. And 2 weeks ago, we did Philip Rieff, and I got an expert. So if you do a presentation on a philosopher, get an expert. Well, who is a Kenneth Smith expert? You could probably count them on one hand, and you'd have fingers left over. And the great thing about that is, of the Kenneth Smith experts that exist on planet Earth, 2 of them are here. So this is probably the best it's ever going to get. I thought I already did that. Okay. So this is so we're probably in a good position to start. Now, as we learned last week, if you just dive into these things, they're very, very controversial, because Kenneth's going to talk a lot about the ancient Greeks, and he's going to talk about things like character types, and he's going to talk about, well, in this essay that you read, he's talking a lot about slavery. Now, that's going to make a lot of people very uncomfortable, because, well, for obvious reasons, what we have in mind about these things is different from the way the ancient Greeks thought about them. And when you talk about things like character types and categorizing people and putting people in ranking, that's against pretty much everything that we as moderns think and understand and comprehend as being right and correct and normal and ordinary and what should be, as we consider society. We consider people are autonomous units, and we should respect people. Let's not misunderstand what Smith is presenting to us. It's very different from what we've been culturally trained to understand. It's different. But before we make a snap judgment, first let's understand what he's trying to get across, and then let's figure out what we want to think about it, yay or nay. first understand and then let's criticize. But before you do that, yeah, put in the homework. And I'm just going to make a quick. Here we go. Okay. All right. So usually I want to start with maybe getting some reactions by people from what they thought about or the essay that we read. These are, if you read this week's and last week's, you now have the flavor of how Kenneth writes and how his mind works, and it's going to get, if anything, even more abstruse and complicated. Oh, here we go. I'm gonna have to keep an eye out. So if anybody wanted to make some quick reactions, what you thought, anybody?
I'm not sure if I read the right essay, but the one I read was he talking about something that kind of remind me of the Republic, of how Plato categorizes different classes of people, right? And okay, so that's one, yeah. But he goes into more detail and probably more up to date about the people that are responding to the reality of the social oppression and social responsibility and so forth, and some people have more than others and so forth, right? Is that what you're referring to by slavery? That some people just they were just born into being slaves because they can't get past a certain point where they could be free to make choices or something like that, right? Okay.
You can see why a lot of people bristle when you start talking about this, and we certainly had a lot of that last week, didn't we? And now I'm actually glad Anne is here now. Hi, Anne, because we had a pretty feisty conversation last week. Actually, it went on after I was gone, and I'm sorry it did. I don't know. Anne's muted. Anne, are you there? Maybe she's busy something.
She's got her mute on.
Yeah, okay. But I did want to respond to a number of things that we were talking about. Like when you start talking about these things, now Kenneth talks about the three rankings, Aristoi, Doloi, Banausic. Let's not make too much of that. Part of the criticism from last week was that we're starting some kind of programmatic scheme to categorize people and thus treat people differently, which is not at all the same way. And Rick did his best to try to clarify. But the way I would say this is, if you know what the Myers-Briggs system is, the MBTI, it's a scheme for categorizing different personality types. Okay, now we understand that, and we understand that that's a scheme that is actually very popular and used in business and used in administration, and to categorize people according to their personality types. There's nothing Orwellian about that. It's just a scheme to categorize the way people are, their tendencies, their orientations, what they have preferences for. But we're not going to impose any kind of fascistic program to dominate people, and in terms of how we treat them and unfairly criticize them or rank them. That's absolutely not what's happening. This is really just a map. Now, a map is a good tool to use if it's useful. And if it's not useful, then don't use it. It's just a way of understanding, well, the lay of the land, understanding the territory. And the Myers-Briggs system is a map. And the scheme that Kenneth is outlining is a map. And, a map is necessarily a simplification. You don't want a map that has everything there is to, a one-to-one scale, because that's useless. Then it doesn't use anything. It doesn't help you at all. You can just slog your way through the reality. You don't
Yeah,
need
we call that the actual place.
yeah, you don't need the map. A map has to be a simplification. So when Kenneth talks about these are the three types of characters, ABC, Aristic, Deloy, Banausic, is this all that human beings are? No, of course not. No more than the Myers-Briggs tells you anything, or your astrological sign would tell you anything more than, one thing about you. There's many things about being a human. Your level of development, your level of education, et cetera, et cetera. And lots of things go into making a human being. This is a map that talks about an orientation, a predisposition that people have towards one way or another. Why people are more interested in, intellectual pursuits or artistic pursuits, and why some people are not. Why some people are more interested in athletics and some people are not. Why some people are more interested in accounting and business, and some people that would be torture for them. It's just the roll of the dice. Any parent could tell you that, or for that matter, any pet owner could tell you. Not all cats are the same. Not all dogs are the same. They have different personalities, and same with human beings. And this is a way of mapping that. And to that extent, it could be very useful if you put it in mind. It's like, why would you talk to, to take one example, if you talk to your uncle who is constantly, every time you meet, constantly pushing you to get an accounting degree and give up your dreams of being a singer or whatever you have. You'll get nowhere with that conversation, because to him, his values are, it's all about making a good living and making money. But, that person's values are not the same as his. And that conversation will never have a good resolution. And you'll get nowhere with it. So if you understand that you're dealing with two different character types, well, then you can relax. You're just never going to solve that problem. The two values are incompatible. They're not going to meet. And that means you don't have to worry about it anymore. You don't have, and it'll make communication with that uncle a lot easier. And you can do the same for coworkers or bosses or teachers or friends or other family members. I think that's where a map is helpful. It actually would make your life easier if you understood that people have different values and they're not ever going to adopt a different value, except in very, very rare cases. Very, very rare cases does someone grow out of a value and learn a different value system. And everything in our modern society retards the ability to change your values after whatever, age 12 or 14. People will never change, mostly. And very few people will. And someone else. Okay.
You feel better?
I feel like I've been talking too much, actually. Rick, you got your hand up. Yeah, go ahead.
So I've been thinking about what we talked about last week and kind of how to explain it better than I did last week. And of course, since that was my first time on one of these, it was not hard to find room for improvement. I've got a couple of things I thought might be helpful to bring to the table with regard to it. The first one is, we talked last week about the language problem. We talked about it a lot, and it deserves a lot of talk, because we are constrained. If we don't have enough words to make the distinctions between things we need to distinguish, then we're constantly going to be tripping over ourselves trying to figure out which of the various meanings we mean. Slavery is a perfect example of that. American race-based commodity slavery is an abomination, and Kenneth will say that right up front. He abhors what we did. And given our experience as Americans, it's natural that the word slavery means that and only means that, and for most of us can only mean that. It's like the word has been taken. It belongs to that now. But even among slaves, there was a lot of discussion about the difference between the slaves who did not want to be slaves and who would escape given the first chance and would free others if they could, and the slaves who slipped into it and said, okay, I'm a slave, I'll just do whatever I'm told. And that you could see that same distinction and mentality in people who in the US were not slaves, people who hypothetically were free, except that really they just wanted to find somebody to tell them what to do because they didn't want to think about it too much. It made them uncomfortable. People who were too appetite driven and were not thinking about, well, what do other people need? Should I sacrifice my needs so that somebody else can be happy? We see these problems well outside of the institution of U.S. slavery. It's a widespread thing. It was a thing in the Middle Ages, and it was a thing in the classical Greek era, which is why the Greeks did their little character typology. So when we talk about this being a map, one of the ways to frame that is that, like we talked about last week, one of Kenneth's core arguments is that to understand life, you need as many perspectives as possible, despite the fact that as moderns, we tend to want to find one true perspective, and then that's our perspective for life, and we duke it out with everybody else to say they're wrong and our perspective is right. As mortals, there is no one perspective that's going to show us the world accurately. It doesn't exist. It's a fool's errand. And so what we desperately need is to get a nice toolkit, a good collection of different perspectives that are well defined, well understood, and each of which illuminates things that the other perspectives miss, and then learn how to flip back and forth between them smoothly, so that when we're facing a problem that our current perspective isn't going to help us with, we look in the toolbox and go, oh, well, okay, let me tell you what Thomas Aquinas would have said in this situation. And maybe Thomas Aquinas' perspective will reveal something about our circumstance that our own modernist perspective has a hard time with. You know, modernism likes to promote itself as science and truth, and it sees everything perfectly. But that's what all systems say. That's what makes them ideologies. They're always saying, you don't need anybody but me. I will give you all the answers. And Kenneth's saying, you can't trust that impulse. You can't trust it from anything that we call an ism. You certainly can't trust it from modernity as a whole either. It's just as subjective in its ways and its values as any other system. So we need to be able to triangulate on it. So the reason he comes back to this three-part Greek typology is that the Greeks, on the one hand, were very alien to us. We are inclined to read the Greeks as though they're just primitive versions of us, but they are not. Their value system was different. Their cosmology was different. Everything was different. And on the other hand, the Greeks were relentlessly documenting everything that they could about themselves and their world. And most cultures never did that. So at a very early point in our history, there they are writing down their arguments with each other, you know, and like, who's right about this thing? Well, that's less important than we want to drop down all their arguments. You know, Plato's dialogues. What did this guy who I disagree with say? And here's all of his bits. And this other guy I disagreed with, what did he say? And so that whole cataloging of antagonistic perspectives is really well documented among the Greeks. And so that's one of the reasons he's bringing it forward. Not because he's saying this is the end all, be all, true all, the one perspective everybody should adopt. That would be the opposite of what Kenneth stands for. But to say, any time that we're trying to face a characterological problem, one of the perspectives we have to be comfortable with and be able to bring to bear is that Greek one, because it's so well documented. And there's been a couple thousand years of argument about it so far. So it's well-trod terrain if we can just pick it up and start using that tool. So that's one of the things I didn't bring last time. The second thing I didn't bring last time that I should have is that it's not just a Greek perspective. I alluded to the fact that Hannah Arendt deals with some of this in her book, The Human Condition, where she talks about the three different domains of economic life and how that roughly corresponds to three modes of thinking about the world. You know, how you think when you're trying to decide whether it's time to eat or if you need to take a bath is very different from how you think when you're trying to figure out how to make money, or if you're trying to do some technical exercise like brain surgery or programming, which again is very different than how you think when you're trying to think about what's good for humanity and what are the overall priorities. I mean, these are very different modes of thought. She picked that stuff up from the Greeks, but she also picked it up from you can see it in Kierkegaard, you can see it in Nietzsche, you can see it in Hegel, you can see it in Marx. All those dialectical people were all talking again about this thesis, antithesis, synthesis approach to understanding the world. And I spent some time this last week reading Hegel in preparation for today's talk to remind myself that what I didn't say last week is you can find the seeds of this douloi, Banausoi, Aristoi structure in Hegel. It's in, and when I say the seeds, I mean he wrote whole books about the differences between these three mentalities and their relationships to each other, and how their relationships to each other mirror the relationships between different kinds of truth in the world. And that, you know, human psychology is imprinted by the structure between assertion, negation, and the negation of the negation that he built his whole cosmology out of. So there's a tremendous amount to this that goes well beyond what the Greeks did. And I'll just wrap up by saying it's not arbitrary that both the Greeks and Hegel came in on the same issue of three different fundamental types, why it's three and not some other number, and why it's these things and not some other thing, the concrete, the abstract, and the principle driven. Hegel has a remark that says, when he was studying Heraclitus, he fell in love with what he found there so thoroughly and uniquely compared to any other philosopher he ever read, that there's not a single precept of Heraclitus's that didn't become some central part of Hegel's system of philosophy. So Hegel sees himself as very influenced by this Greek structure. And when you look back at Heraclitus's statements about struggle and war between principles as being the cause of all the phenomena that we experience in the world, there is a direct relationship between that and what Kenneth Smith is doing with douloi, Banausoi, and Aristoi. So I just wanted to throw that out there because I completely neglected that last week when we were talking.
Yeah. Well, as I was saying, character types are one jigsaw puzzle piece of the whole, but only one piece. And it's an important piece, but it is only one piece. And we would no more try to treat people in society differently according to their character type, any more so than we would according to their astrological sign. You know, I mean, no one's going to create a society and say, oh, all Libras should be the accountants and the bankers, and all the Sagittarians should be the athletes because they're good at that, and all the Leos should be in charge. I mean, that doesn't make any sense, right? It would be absurd. Well, no more so than a system that characterizes character types as inherently greater or lesser, you know, ranking them on hierarchically according to, you know, the gains and benefits and what they're denied in society. I mean, that's not at all what's being said here. And it's tough to understand that, but yeah, this is just a ranking of people's predispositions, let's say. So what I would like to think it would be interesting is if we take selected passages from the article. I'll dive right into the meat of it, where he talks directly about slavery. The purpose of ancient slavery is not to exploit the weakest, poorest, or feeblest. Those who've been blighted by nature deserve our humanitarian help. The purpose of slavery is to take care of them, to help adapt them to the complexities of a civilizational superstructure that exceeds not just their intellect, but their conscience, their judgment, their will, their appetites, their consciousness as well. This is on the second part of the near the halfway point. Yeah, it's very, very well, when you present something like that to the modern, as Rick and I are saying, when you present something like that to the modern sensibility, yeah, it seems questionable because it seems paternalistic. It seems like you're taking yourself as a higher place, and that you can guide other people who are necessarily below you, which is the opposite of our very egalitarian, equalized understanding of humanity that we in the West have grown up with our entire lives. And that's part of our core mythology, is that understanding that all men are created equal. This is exactly the opposite of what the ancient Greeks are saying, had understood. That no, all men are not created equal. No more so than all cats have the same personality. Now, the problem and the reason why we went away from that was because of all the horrors and the problems that historically were created by a hierarchical system, a monarchical system of having kings and emperors and tribal warrior chieftains who, gave us, historically, the many, many thousands of years of warfare and murder and rapine and horror that engulfed the world for throughout history. And so what the American Revolution, the American experiment was let's no longer have emperors and kings and tribal chieftains, and let's have a system of democracy. A terrific step forward for humans.
Yeah.
By taking the horrors of having a hierarchical system as the only way that can exist as a system of understanding how humans should be arranged, then of course it's going to be considered as something that is terribly retarding for human progress. But that's not the case. If you consider that, some people are better athletes than I am. Some people are smarter than me. Some people have more education than me. Some people are more experts and more skilled at some things than I am. And that's the case for everybody. We should not have a system of, pure democracy where everybody gets to vote because, you're not educated enough to know what would be the best thing. And that's what a representative democracy is supposed to be. You're supposed to elect someone who will serve as a representative for the group of people that they're representing, who have enough skill and expertise and knowledge and, theoretically, who are going to be able to make good decisions better than the mass populace will. And it's the same thing for education. A teacher will educate people, students. So the concept of slavery, as the ancient Greeks understood it, was for a variety of reasons. Some people do need to have, well, what they called a master. Someone who was going to direct them appropriately through life. We bristle at the terminology due to the way we understood slavery, which was entirely race-based and entirely, based on the color of your skin, or in some cases, according to, your financial means. And that's absolutely not. That would be against everything the Greeks understood. It would be, if you impose a system of either master or slavery onto a person who is not characterologically fit for that position, then that would be the error. If someone is a master, then they are fit to be a master. If someone is a slave, then they are fit to be a slave. And of course, in the ancient Greek system, there was a method for a slave. If it was appropriate and if conditions were met, a slave could sue for freedom under certain conditions that was possible. I mean, there was a famous story. I forget exactly who, but one slave at a slave auction was surveying the crowd and said to the auctioneer, "Sell me to that one. He looks like he could use an appropriate slave." You know, it was a collaborative system in the sense that everybody knew what was going on. It wasn't imposed against somebody's will, which is all we think slavery is, because that's the way it was practiced for the West.
That's
Yeah.
what we did.
Like,
Yeah, I'm always
it's
missing.
like applying for a job then,
Go
right?
ahead, Rick.
It's just like applying for a job.
Yes.
Right, right. But I think I haven't read Hegel's idea of master slave, but it sounds like he sees as a kind of an evolution towards where the slave becomes more free and takes more responsibility, doesn't he? And we can't ignore the element of exploitation by the system that sets up a hierarchical system that exploits the slaves, where they have no choice of who they're going to be work as an employee or those kinds of elements are beyond what the Greeks maybe are saying. I don't know.
I think you got it exactly right. Yeah. We have a comment right now that yeah, we still have slaves. We don't call them slaves. We call them employees.
Sure.
And they get a paycheck every Friday.
Right.
But we just changed the terminology. We didn't get rid of the reality. Yeah.
Right. But the point is, should they be exploited? Shouldn't they have a union or someone to represent their interests? And should they be able to negotiate for the correct pay and for their work?
Right. Yeah.
Well, there's actually slavery is still in the United States. I just saw this documentary 13th that talks about the mass incarceration. This was shocking that the big corporations are actually in contracts with prisons to get free labor from the prisoners. Yeah. And this is going on in the millions. So slavery is still there. We just don't know about it or don't care to think about it. Right.
And it's probably based on race too, right?
Yep.
Yeah. This is one of the things that Kenneth is doing with this. So there's a couple pieces here. So why does Kenneth write so provocatively? One of the things that's interesting to me about this essay that David chose is that he gives you a little microbiography of his life. And it becomes clear that characterologically, he was that way since he was a little kid. He just loved coming up with logic bombs to torment his peers and his teachers. He enjoyed it. He liked saying, well, if this is your belief system, well, then what do you do about this? He'd pull out some contradiction inherent in what they were saying, and then they'd get angry at him, and then he'd be happy. This is like part of his motivation was sabotaging people for the problems with their belief system. So it was natural he went into philosophy. There's a certain mischief that can be productive in philosophy. And part of what he's doing here by coming at us on the issue of slavery is confronting us with the idea that our belief system about ourselves and what we actually do are out of sync with each other. We pretend that we're egalitarian, even though, was it Yale or Princeton who did the study that basically proves we're an oligarchy? It's just like demonstrably, easily, we're not even remotely an egalitarian society. We are an oligarchy. The folks in charge more or less usually get what they want, and everybody else more or less usually does not get what they want, no matter how many of them want it together. And that's just the way it is. So our models, the modernist model, involves a great deal of false consciousness about our actual circumstances. And one of the ways to solve that is to do this trick of saying, well, what would the medieval people say if they were to look at what we're doing? And what would the Greeks say if they were to look at what we're doing? And how would they feel about it? And from that, you can generate these very interesting but uncomfortable criticisms of our system that are hard to express in modernist terms. It's hard to say. I mean, we have terms like wage slave, but we always mean them kind of half, but of course we're all free as a subtext. It's like half joking, half not there. I mean, in other words, we're not really willing to come to grips with how unequal the current situation is. And, you know, there's a lot of nuance that's lost in a discussion like this, because if we talk about Greek slavery, then we have a problem because Athenian slavery and Spartan slavery are so unbelievably different from each other. You know, it's like they used to train the free people in Sparta by having to go massacre some slaves. So that would not happen in Athens. These were completely different systems. It was more varied back then. So again, we run into this language problem. But here's what we can see. What was the promise, right, of modernism? The promise of modernism was that by getting rid of the officially admitted to hierarchies, that we would result in a just system for everybody. We would eliminate the exploitation that used to happen. We would eliminate the genocide and the mass warfare that used to happen. All those terrible things that we associated with systems that said, "Hi, I keep slaves," would go away under modernism. That was the promise. And we would be more peaceful and have a more equal society. So the question is, if we can step outside for a second from our mindset and the way that we're programmed to think and talk about our current system, and we just hold it to those metrics, we can ask the question, did we keep our promise? Did we have fewer, are the genocides gentler than they used to be? Is everybody treated more equal? Do we have less war and the wars are less appalling? Or is it the other way around, that we've actually made the worst genocides in history, the worst wars in history? And frankly, since American slavery was part of the capitalist system and part of the modernist system, the worst slavery in history under this system that purported that all men are created equal, right? We've sort of sabotaged ourselves. There's an enormous discrepancy between what we promise the system delivers and what it actually delivers. And core to the mismatch between the two is the following. If somebody's a serial rapist, should you put them in charge of a nunnery? If somebody is a serial thief, should you put them in charge of the bank? If somebody is all about, stomping on other people to make himself feel better, should you make him president? It's like, if we pretend everybody's equal and we pretend there's no differences, how does that work out for us? And is it sane compared to saying, well, if somebody's a serial rapist, maybe there's some place in the world where they could be productive, but there's a lot of places where they should not go. And they should not be given authority. That's what a caste system, a system that admits it has castes, is based on. The idea of you try to figure out what people are suited for and what they're not suited for. An anti-caste system in which you have castes but pretend you don't is a system in which it is very easy for bad actors to get in charge of things they should never be in charge of, because nobody's allowed to say, this man's a thief. Why would we give him all our money? He's a thief. Let's not do it, right? So this is the subtext, and of course, all the way through this, well, we're all squirming and uncomfortable because our models for explaining ourselves and what we're doing don't fit our circumstances. And, we're sort of stuttering and, not sure what to do. Somewhere in the background, Kenneth Smith is chuckling, going, my logic bomb is working. All these people are being compelled uncomfortably, but they're being compelled to think about this in a different way. I'm so happy. I'm so happy. That's Kenneth, right? That's how he is.
That can only be a good thing. Absolutely. Once you are thinking, once you're uncomfortable, then yeah, you're thinking. You're starting to question things.
Could I ask a question of David and Rick? So Kenneth seems to be very, very sharp at criticizing and kind of like breaking the veil of what's real in our modern world. And I'm wondering, does he also propose solutions to that or not? I mean, because there's a difference between, enjoying throwing logic bombs, but there's also, at least for
right,
me,
yeah. No, I remember what we talked about last week. I'll be more sober in my response. No, I've talked about this with Kenneth actually, and yeah, there's a problem with talking about this stuff, is because you're saying, oh well, you're saying we should all go back to the way the ancient Greeks lived. That would solve everything. No, no, I don't think. Well, first of all, that would be impossible. That wouldn't be desirable, I don't think.
And Kenneth doesn't think so either.
Yeah, if there's any solution, it would be something that we would have to create together with all this in mind, but it would take a long process. It would have to be, a creative, experimental, exploratory process. And we don't have anywhere near the resources available right now. I think we talked about this last week. Anything that we would consider Aristoi, or the best of the best who know our history and literature and art and intelligence pursuits. The only thing we have right now is academia, which is entirely irrelevant to conversation, to the public conversation. We just need. We've exterminated that from public dialogue, and that is, I think, a huge part of the problem, which effectively renders the possibility of any kind of solution almost impossible.
And he makes the argument that the extermination was not a coincidence or an accident. It's because Aristoi get in the way of Banausic exploiting everybody, right? I mean, if you're an Aristos, if you actually care about the big picture and its effect on everybody, then when you watch people, being horrifically rounded up into concentration camps or treated like disposable labor or what have you, you're going to be outraged. You're going to want to do something about it, which is part of what characterizes the Aristoi. You're going to become a problem for the Banausic. So the Banausic have, invented sophisticated systems of PR, right? I mean, the whole creation of the manufacture of consent is at the level of technology we do it now is a very modern creation, very technological, very systemic, very Banausic, to serve Banausic ends, to make sure that nobody comes between a Banausos and his prey. The man needs millions of people to exploit, who can live in misery so he can be wealthy. Well, he's going to make sure that the people who are inclined to stop that are befuddled, that they live in poverty, that the law doesn't support the things that they try to do, that, on every possible angle they can turn, we're going to find that the legal system, the social system, the economic system, all of their systems are designed to tie them in knots and keep them from being able to act. It's like the principle of a straitjacket is that if you try to pull one way, you're tying yourself up the other way. Every movement you do rebounds back upon itself into a trap. And that's where any potential Aristoi find themselves today, including Kenneth. So part of his core argument is that the very first step to making a better world is to get a much better toolbox for understanding the situation that we're in, because it's basically a labyrinth. It's been designed through human sophistication to defeat human sophistication. If you have values and principles, if you are very, very, very smart, if you are motivated to make a better world, you will discover that the modern world has anticipated you at every turn, and that at least half of your actions that you take to try to solve the problem will instead actually extend the labyrinth.
So would you say that Kenneth Smith is a pessimist or an optimist when it comes to the future?
Neither. I'm going to go out on a limb here. Maybe David's had this conversation with Kenneth. I haven't yet, but I'm going to propose that he's neither an optimist nor a pessimist, nor a realist, because no human being's a realist. Whenever someone says I'm a realist,
I disagree. I think he's definitely a realist because of the sharpness of being able to bring out the reality that he's criticizing.
Well, I think what he is a meliorist. And meliorism is based on the principle that we don't know in advance whether we're all doomed or whether everything's going to be great. So optimism and pessimism are not justified. And realism is based on the premise that we aren't making any critical mistakes in our understanding of the world. And we know that's not the case. So all three of those end up off. Nihilism, relativism, all of the standard positions end up being shoved off to the side. And meliorism says, I can tell you this much. The world could be better than it is right now. Any of us can look around and see things that could be improved. And sometimes we do that by looking back in history and seeing times when we actually did better than we're doing now. And sometimes we do it just because we're familiar enough with some part of the problem that we can actually see the solution, whether or not we're allowed to implement it. And if that's true, if it can be made better than it is now, then it's possible that later, if we did that, there would still be problems and we could make it better than that. And so it's based on the idea of incremental iterative improvement rather than trying to predict what the outcome is. It says, I don't know whether we're doomed or whether we're going to be saved or what, but what I do know is I could make things better, and that as an aristos, I have an obligation to try to make things better. And that I'll leave the whole prognostication about how it all ends to other people who are more confident in their ability to see the future than we are. I would guess that's where he is.
It seems like there's hope when the people who are in charge are not able to put the right president in charge, and the whole system just collapses, right?
You're thinking of the current presidency.
And then maybe there's hope that the next person comes in is not the same kind of person that those in charge want to put in charge.
Well, it seems to me that the whole political system is broken as well. So, I mean, even though there's hope that every 4 years something better might come along, when you look at history, it's not. Yeah,
I'm just looking at the present situation where there was an article, particularly about that, where if we come through this, and Joe Biden takes over, I mean, the whole system is on the verge of collapse. And so he could, do some things that will make it much better, or somewhat better, right? In an effort to try to save it. Yeah. So there might be hope in that. It shows that how the incompetence of those people in charge, right? And that they want to stay in charge, but they don't have the competence to pick the right person to be in charge. Someone like what we have now, right?
Yeah.
Certainly, the study of different eras in history is a useful way to get out. There's a trap that people can get into where we assume that it has to be this way and this is the only choice, right? There's a fatalism that is associated with nihilism that's based on the premise that my current circumstances that I'm so familiar with are universalized to extend to human nature. Humans can only be like this. This is all they can be. Nothing could be better. I mean, we've all heard it in our lives. We've heard, whether we've been the one saying it or whether it's somebody around us saying it, is a very common proposition that we shouldn't even try to make anything different because this is just how people are. But the more you study history, especially studying the differences in worldviews between different eras, the easier it is to see that how we are now is not some universal human nature. It's not. It is a very specific phase in history that systemically produces a very specific configuration of ways to see the world. Certain people are promoted or demoted based on the way that the system is structured. And at other times in history, it has been structured very, very differently, and it has produced very different results. And what that tells us is not to be certain about whether things are going to end well or going to end badly. But what we can be certain about is that there is an enormous danger in trying to universalize from our limited experience. The moment that we start saying nothing could be any different from this, we're also saying I'm omniscient and I know all of human history and I know what's possible for human beings. Whereas if we actually study the history, we can see that it is clearly possible for human beings to behave differently than they do under these circumstances. The system of perverse incentives drives us towards certain kinds of behavior, and then our thoughts and feelings follow along and try to justify why we're doing these things and make it sustainable. The whole putting on a leash, I'm seeing the comments from Anne and others. The whole thing about putting on a leash, here's the leash. Should a rapist be in charge of a nunnery? Yes or no? If your answer is no, then you believe in putting a leash on people. Should a thief be in charge of a bank? Should a child molester be in charge of a classroom of children? If the answers to any of these things are no, then you believe in putting a leash on people. That's the leash. The leash is that you should not put people into circumstances where their vices are going to result in terrible behavior. You shouldn't give people authority that they can't be responsible with. And it's not some kind of universal thing. We're all different from each other and what our strengths and weaknesses are. We should have more freedom on the things that we're better at and less freedom on the things that we're bad at. I'm studying Kobudo right now. We're working with the traditional Okinawan martial arts weapons. I'm not a master. I don't want to be in charge of a classroom. I should not do any of those things. I want to find myself a sensei who knows more than I do and have him teach me that stuff. But when it comes to doing medical software programming, I've been doing this for 35 years. I should be teaching classrooms. I should be leading people. So I should have different kinds of things, that I'm in charge of or not in charge of. And that's how it should be for any of us in life. And if we want to learn more and grow more and get to the place where we're able to be in charge of some particular thing that we're not able to now, that should be how the system is built, that we can grow and improve within the capacity that we have to do that. I mean, that seems like justice to me at a very basic level. So I don't know. That's kind of my initial reaction to the rejection of the on a leash language. It's like, well, I hope we want to put people like that on a leash, the people who have those problems, because if not, we're setting ourselves up for, having Hitler be in charge and put a bunch of Jews in a concentration camp. He had been going to do that from a lot earlier point in his life than the point when he actually took the action. Anybody could have seen a lot of that coming. It was the way his character was built. It was the way he was structured. It was, he wanted to be in charge. He wanted to get wealthy. He knew that he was very good at riling people up and getting them angry at minority groups. That whole train wreck was coming from a long time in advance. I think it's the height of injustice to say we must allow him first to murder enormous millions of people and only afterwards step in and say, tisk, tisk. Now justice can be done. After you've killed everybody, now justice can be done. Not if we could see it coming. We would have an obligation to stop it. So, and I'm not talking about genetics in response to JB. Nothing in Kenneth Smith talks about why people fall into these character types. Maybe it's nature, maybe it's nurture, maybe it's a combination, maybe it's the way that the perverse incentives work in the system you're born into. Maybe somebody who would do horrible things in the modern world would have behaved differently in the medieval world or vice versa. I mean, this is a very complicated thing, human behavior. And neither Kenneth nor I am proposing any kind of simple-minded equation that, you can always see these things in advance.
Yet if you asked Trump and his friends what they were doing, they would portray themselves as avatars of the noble and the good, and they would pull out their marketing PR team, and they would just, by the magical power of fiat and confidence, define the good as what they were doing. They would be like, oh, this is the good. Look up the good. It says, see figure 1. Oh, it's a snapshot of Trump. So,
figure 1, I have all the money.
So I always, back in the olden days, people like to use the word postmodern a lot because it was the hot thing. And so I still have that sickness where I'm trying to find places to mention it. So this is a good time to point out that the postmodern condition, which is a refusal to allow value hierarchies to exist. And at the same time, it's a rejection of historical difference. So it throws up a picture of like the Sphinx, but he's wearing Ray-Bans next to like Hong in the Empire State Building with some ancient samurai painting in the background. So this is what you're doing is you're saying that there is no historical difference. So it's not an accident because historical difference gives you critical distance and power over the current condition, including the ones that are forming your own desires. So this is a psychedelic act. Is you're trying to leave the culture that constructed you partly. Partly you have this rational faculty that can compare things and see that something's actually better. But you're really so that's why conservatives are saying, oh, the radical project is incoherent because you're biting the hand that feeds you. You're biting the hand that feeds you. And actually, yes, that's right. So the system is made to us in a certain way. Okay. Anyway, here's the punchline. So here's how you solve the problem in a way that gets everyone on board, even conservatives. And it's supposed to be this internal critique that you mentioned earlier. The system says liberty, equality, fraternity. It's not living up to its own promises. The name of the system, it says the subtitle of its brand is liberty, equality, fraternity. That brand is living up to its brand image. So who could disagree with that? So this was Habermas's idea. He thought that the doorway to the utopia is just getting the rulers to confess that they failed to live up to their own mottos, and just sit down and say, look, be really, really honest. Look, okay, we're shooting 20 black people per week, and it's on entertainment television. Just let's be objective for a minute. Does this look right? Does this look right? And they would hem and haw, and they'd be like, oh shit, yeah, you're right. Fuck. And so there was this hope that reason would slowly work the system into health, as long as you could get people to agree on the definitions of the terms and then hold things up one by one and check it against the criteria, So when marketers are powerful enough, that can't happen, because you could redefine the good, the true, the beautiful, the right, and the just by slapping some like cowboy hats and like a hot girl and Daisy Dukes and like a hanging black man and some good music. It all kind of works together in a way, and it overcomes the power of reason.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole modern industry of PR and spin is extraordinarily dangerous. We take it for granted because it's all around us all the time, but it is just shocking how much evil can be done by emotionally manipulating people and intellectually manipulating people to support deeply evil things while thinking that they're doing very, very good things. It is amazing how in the 20th century the things that we've been able to talk people into doing. And we opened that Pandora's box on the theory that you could make a lot of money by doing it. I mean, the premise was, if I can convince people to buy my product, I'll make more money. It's like those are the exact same techniques that Himmler and Hitler and all these other guys used in order to justify exterminating millions of people.
That's right. This is where technical reason or instrumental reason has become so subtle that now it's doing big data collections and manipulating human self-concept and their own desire. We can make this guy worry about, what does it say? Oh, his penis size and, his self-image. Okay, so let's do a penis size self-image thing. And then, geez, well, if you can program everyone that way, then you can program the future, because you'll be steering desires.
Yes. And this is where the logic bomb that Kenneth is trying to throw at us last week and this week comes into play. Because what's our response? Our responses to this are terrible. All the people who hate the Holocaust and who hate the wrong things going on in the world, who wish that things could be better, their solutions are awful. Like, we double down. We say, the reason the Holocaust happened was because people weren't rational enough. They weren't scientific enough. We make this list that has the exact same list that led us into the Holocaust in the first place. One of the things that nobody wants to talk about is that Germany was not the most superstitious and backward country in the world. It was the most scientifically advanced and educated country in the world. And they did their Holocaust scientifically, right? IBM made gazillions of dollars selling the machines that did the statistics and allowed people to keep track of who was to be exterminated and who went to what tank and what, to which camp and what. The massive amounts of science and technology and sophistication and intelligence and education and reason and logic were brought to bear on the extermination of all those people. And those are the things that we say are the solution, right? When we see something like the current thing about Trump, what most people don't like about Trump is that he's this isn't a Godwin point. This is the existential state of the 20th century of modernism. It's impossible to talk about modernism without talking about the Holocaust, because the promise that the founding fathers made, the promise that the Enlightenment made, all those people, they said, if you do the following things, you'll get a better world. But we got the Holocaust. So we have to be able to account for it. It's not a distraction. It's not a side issue. It's right at the center of the target.
If you ever watched the greatest artifact ever made by humans, it's called The Ascent of Man. It's a BBC video series that came out in like '72. The last episode, so he's a guy that shows the relationship between ideology and like the current like physical map. So the last episode is the Holocaust in quantum mechanics. And he's like, how ironic that at this time in history where we peer down into the very foundation of nature and find that nature itself is uncertain, it's indeterminate, and our free willing faculty creates it. How ironic that at the same time the engineers of Germany were just so certain that economic problems came from Jewishness. It was just the cheesiest, most ridiculous solution to the situation. Where's the cause? Give us a cause that we can see. Oh, it looks like a Jew. Oh no, okay. Oh, thank God. Certainty. So the craving for certainty is what brought it around. And at the end of the episode, the producers couldn't believe this. It brought them all to tears. He walks out into the wet ashes in the cemetery in his shoes and just gets down on the ground and picks up some of the ashes. And then they roll the credits. And that's the end of the whole.
See, I gotta watch that. Right.
So uncertainty versus the Holocaust.
Yeah. Well, and you see it. You see the defects in our understanding of how we got here, in the way that people criticize the current administration, right? The characterization that Democrats do of Republicans is that the Republicans are all ignorant, uneducated, working class, racist, backwater people, right? They say it's the flyover states. They say it's the South. They say if only these people were educated, they could never have done these. They would never support the things they support. Well, the Germans were educated, right? They were more educated than we were. Their standard of literacy, their number of university degrees, all that stuff was better than the United States, and they did a Holocaust. So how do we explain this idea that if we just pour more information, right, and so on into people and teach them to be more rational, that we expect that suddenly they will become better people? But
it may be that people have an appetite for Schadenfreude, and it's just there, and it can be triggered. So that if you're miserable in a trailer park, you want to know that if you were black, it would be worse. And having a proximal worse is the relative foundation of your happiness. Because happiness is just differential. It's entirely differential. They study this. The Economist even says this. Kids kicking cans naked in Brazil in ghettos are happier than kids at Eton. Yeah, and I'm not ho 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 wink wink. No, in all the possible ways you can objectively measure happiness, they're actually happier. Why? Because there's people that are lepers, and if you see the lepers, you're like, Jesus, thank God. I mean, God, I give you thanks, and you really mean it because you really could be a leper. So for people to have a black underclass and a Mexican hated underclass, what a relief to the lower classes. That's a great gift. So Republicans said, we're going to fuck you economically, but we're going to give you this gift of a visible suffering other, and it worked.
Yeah. And the other thing that comes with that is when we look at the statistics on supporters of Trump, they aren't all people without university degrees. A shocking number of them are high wealth, high education, urban professionals. There are an enormous number of those people who are all for Trump. We just don't want to talk about them because they don't fit our model. We literally erase part of our current circumstances from the model, from what we see in the world, because we are more committed to our model than we are to solving our problems. And this is where Kenneth comes in. This is why he's poking us. Is he's saying, look, you all think that you're rational. You think as moderns, as people who care about science and reason and logic, you think you're seeing the world the way it is. But he has this email chain in which he talks about current events. He just grabs articles at random out of the paper and goes at them. And case after case after case after case, we prove that, in fact, we don't see the world objectively, and we aren't assessing it correctly, and we don't understand why we're in the circumstances we're in. No matter how smart we are, we have these little formulas that we've been programmed into us during our civics classes or social studies or through reading the newspaper about how we think America works and how we think science in the modern world works, that we rely on instead of actually looking honestly at our circumstances and what's going on. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to face it directly without the comfort of our reinterpretations, our Procrustean bed to bend everything to fit our preconceived notions of what it means to be modern.
Yeah. Because criticism now would be so.
Challenge Rick's points for a second, because from the limited knowledge that I have about the Holocaust is that it was more about scapegoating and actually Hitler catering to the emotions over rationality. And I agree with you that it was a highly scientific, highly rational country, but I think, like, I don't know what the percentage are, but a lot of them escaped because they were rational before, and anybody who remained, who were actually Germany was coming out of a massive depression after the war, and so it only took a really passionate orator to sway the masses, which, if you compare to what's going on today, is very comparable, except that because there is rationality, that's a reason we haven't gone into Germany 1939 in this country. So I think rationality always trumps emotions, personally.
Have you seen the news out of Portland?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know about ICE and the federal troops on the streets attacking demonstrators?
Yes.
So we think that,
it's happening, right?
Every week that we move deeper into this, we take another step. It took a while to ramp up in the 30s. You've seen the stats about the number of children and adolescents in our concentration camps who've been molested by ICE guards and by Border Patrol. I mean, it's shocking. They're rape camps, right?
Shocking, right. So as rational philosophers, I mean, we kind of try to look at the causes of that, don't we?
Well, we should be.
Right.
We should be, and that's what Kenneth is challenging us to do. He's saying, you know, as long as you think inside the terms of the system that you belong to, there will be certain things that system would prefer nobody think, and you will find it very hard to express or think about those things. He's got this term. He's got a pair of terms here. One of them is a SURD, S-U-R-D, an inexpressible idea. That there are some ideas that, from the context of the culture that you're in, you can't think or say. It's been ruled out by all the propositions that you've accepted. It kind of ties in with Gödel's theorem in that sense, that any attempt to describe the world casts a shadow over some part of the world it's trying to describe, because no precept that we can state is precise enough to not have a certain blur around it. And so cultures create these combinations of precepts that rule out certain possibilities from us to be able to think about. Like, it is very hard for Americans to admit that we live in a caste system.
So is that a propaganda thing? Is it a language thing, or is it an emotion over?
Well, it's the model that we have to explain what America is and how its government works and how its society works. We have all these precepts and a priori positions, our propositions from which we begin reasoning, rule out the possibility, because what makes America America, supposedly to an American, is that we don't have castes, we don't have classes, we don't have kings. Everybody's free, everybody's equal, anybody can rise, there's opportunity, and we always have enough examples to point to cherry pick. Like, we'll point at Bill Gates and say, look, it's Bill Gates. Bill Gates proves that nobody in America is oppressed, because after all, you can be the child of an immigrant and become one of the richest people in the world. And we buy that because the way that we logic, our structures of logic in America are designed to accept that as an example and as proof. And then we just look away from the concentration camps because they don't fit, right? They're hard to say.
Right.
He has this term that goes along with SURD called nescience, spelled like science with an N-E in front. And nescience is the act of erasing and not seeing things. And he says the nescience of a rational mind is in many ways more important to understanding the structure of that mind than its consciousness. We take great pride in the things in the real world that we see and can prove. See, that's part of the real world, and I saw it, so I'm objective. But all the things that we erase from the real world because of the structure of our reasoning, those we neither take pride in nor are ashamed of, because we don't even admit they're there. It is a natural part of the modernist worldview to assume a priori as a birthright that we get to see the world objectively, unlike everybody else in history. They were all stupid and superstitious, but we're scientific. We see the world the way it is. Right? We're taught this in school. We're taught it in the newspaper. We're taught it in our TV shows. It's everywhere you turn in American culture. There's this constant feedback about how modern we are, how progressive we are, how advanced we are. And what that does is it sets us up to assume that we're not being hoodwinked.
Right. But it doesn't discount rationality and objective.
No.
The problem is the erasing you're talking about.
Yeah.
You said it's an active. You said it's active erasing, but you mean that it is. You don't mean that it is conscious. It's probably subconscious, and it is not active in that sense, right?
Exactly.
And that's actually the difficult part, is that it is subconscious and it's almost like a feature of mind. That's why it's maybe not even able to overcome it completely. It's just being aware of it is a first step.
Right. That's exactly right. That's what Kenneth would say right off the bat. And applying that to Carl's point, yeah, what he's saying is these are great tools that we have for thinking about the world. The problem is that they have defects, and that we don't want to admit the defects are there. And as a result, we're vulnerable to those defects. We're speaking of Anne's reference to leashes, we're leashed to the defects in our thinking because we can't admit that they're happening. And therefore they have complete control.
And something else, Fred Jameson says that all of culture is the attempt by the ruling class to legitimize and naturalize their position. So you have tales of natural human aggression, like the Hobbesian state of war. These are myths of aggression. And the ruling class says, we know from history, don't we, that things could be a lot worse.
Right.
So just thank us that we're only chopping off 100 heads a year, because it could be 1,000,000 heads a year. You know it. And then you're like, yeah. So, and also God, Jesus, and nature and biology wants the system to look like American capitalism. This is the end of history. Don't you see the things have been moving to this? And we finally done it. And this, it's a suffering and it's sick, but this is the best configuration of sickness and suffering that we've had so far. And so nature and God want it to be this way.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly right. You see it. It's almost impossible not to read it every day in the newspaper. Like almost every single day when people talk about rioters, right? Chaos, the dangers of if we take the boot off the throat, then people will just destroy everything. Look how crazy they are, right? The Fox News, when they were covering the Capitol Hill autonomous zone in Seattle, took photographs from other cities and put them in the coverage to say, see, Seattle's on fire. And of course, none of that was happening. That police station was never burned. It was fine. And in fact, none of the demonstrators went into it because they were afraid, of it being painted that way. And so since they didn't help, Fox News went ahead and just took the pictures from other cities and ran it with the stories. And the reason it worked, the reason people didn't go, oh, you liars. I mean, they did in minorities, but the reason they didn't generally is because we've all been programmed with the understanding that if it weren't for fascism, we'd all be dead from the chaos of crazy people who are violent and terrible. And thank God we're all living in an institutionalized police state, because otherwise terrible things would happen, right? Which was exactly the argument that the Nazis made during the 1930s in their rise to power.
And that's exactly what the elderly couple said last week when they came out with their pistols, and like a few like pink-haired teenage protesters, like kids, were just walking down the street. So rationally, they came out with pistols ready to shoot, because they weren't reacting to the humans on the street. They were reacting to Fox News's story of human nature on the street.
Right.
That's what they came out to see.
Right. Yeah. And so what all of this shows is that, it's if you know what your programming is and you can admit it's there, and you can Kenneth talks about dislocating the joint of your mind to turn it around to look at itself in a way that it's not designed to do, but can be made to do, then you can begin to create more free will for yourself by recognizing the programming and making choices about it, instead of having it just rule us and determine what we do. But to do that, we have to be able to admit that we are not living at the end of history in the most objective of all possible worlds, and there's nothing left to look at or criticize. The moment we accept the proposition of modernism, we're slaves, we're trapped. Whether we're Aristotelian or not, he says, one of the things he says is all Aristotelian or modernism are deformed. He's not pointing to some class of people and saying, like Plato did, that those people should be in charge. He's like, no, we're a mess. There's this society is designed to warp us, and it works. We're all warped, right? But if we can start to admit that we're warped and look at the warpage, then we can start to correct for the distortions in our perception of the world and be able to make different decisions. So Anne's mentioning in the comments something that applies directly to this. Why does Kenneth talk about leashes? Right? That's abhorrent. Why should we be leashing people? Kenneth's quoting Diogenes of Sinope. And Diogenes of Sinope, who was a cynic, not of the modern flavor, but of the original flavor, the old Greek flavor, he said that for the proper conduct of life requires either right reason or a leash. He's like, either you get your head straightened out and your values to behave like a decent human being and respond to the world as it really is, or you need somebody to restrain you from doing the things that you think are a good idea that are actually awful. Right? If somebody has a problem where they are, for example, a serial child molester, and these people exist, I know because I had some in my family, somebody needs to put them on a leash. And we don't mean physically on the ground in a collar with a leash. We mean they must be prevented from ever being put into a situation where they're going to act on this drive that they can't stop themselves from acting on. And it's not just when things are that ingrained in people. But even for us, who are trying to be good people, when it comes to our programming, we will support things that are bad ideas and that will harm the world up until the point where we start to understand our defects in our programming and can make free choices about them. As this thing that we were just talking about, as long as we are trapped within the delusions that have us, Kierkegaard, right? What a delusion most needs to realize in order to escape the delusion is the very thing the delusion is structured to prevent you from thinking. Because if that weren't the case, it wouldn't be a delusion. That's the definition of a delusion. The key to escape is the thing that you can't express in terms of the delusion. So as long as we're trapped in a delusion about some topic, that's not a topic it's safe for us to be making choices about. Somebody who's not deluded about that should be making choices. And we should work on getting our heads straight about whatever that thing is. And once we get our heads straight and our values straight, then we should be able to make choices about that thing. That's what Diogenes is saying. He's saying, you don't get to say, I want to be a selfish, brutal idiot and be in charge of everything, because that would result in, well, what would it result in? Let's think. Can we think of an example of a country that could tell us what would happen if that were to happen? Diogenes foresaw that. And he said, that's a terrible idea. He says, people like that should not be allowed to wield the power that they are not fit to wield. But as people grow and change over life, if they grow and change over life, then they should be able to wield the power that they are fit to wield without hurting others. So, that's all he means. Every time he says leash, every single time he says leash, he's quoting Diogenes.
So I'm not a software engineer, but I've always thought that you could compare the human condition or our biases as programming. You mentioned the word programming and software. I was thinking, like, to me, like, progress from the caves to today, for example, I've always saw it as somebody like making apps like 2.0 and 3.0 and 4.0 and always ameliorating, right, and improving our conditions. And what you're talking about is really completely changing the software. Like, I think that's doable. Can it? Can it be done? Can we change the software so that we can maybe overcome our delusions and think better?
Certainly in my own life, I could point to opinions and ideas and drives that I had earlier in my life that were deeply mistaken, and that made my life and the people around me miserable. And through doing the work on them, I was able to become a better person than I was before that. And certainly the whole premise of Greek anthropoculture and paideia is that you should structure society in a way that instead of exploiting people's problems and weaknesses, you create paths for them to grow in. And you create safe zones in which they can have those weaknesses and work on them without hurting themselves or others. It's not about stamping out, Brave New World style clones who all think the same thing. It's about trying to structure society the way that we do with children, where we say, if you're still throwing temper tantrums, you probably shouldn't be driving a car.
Right.
But when you get over that, then you can drive a car.
Right. Would that be education?
See, to the way I think of it and the way I interpret what Ken is saying, he's talking about a lifelong educational system. Instead of saying, okay, you're 18 now, so regardless of whether you're a psychopath or a saint, you can be president. Maybe it should be, all the way through life, we keep growing and we keep developing and we keep, trying to work on the things that we're not good at and become better people.
Right. And also the type of education, like the curriculum. Not to discount, math and English and all stuff, but also an education in psychology and overcoming biases and critical thinking. And all this stuff that you probably wait till you're in college, maybe that should be done from the very beginning.
Yeah, how do we not teach first graders the basic principles of what to do when you get angry? How is that not a class? I look at the adult world and I'm like, clearly these people needed a class on, when you're angry, you shouldn't go beat up some people, right? You shouldn't grab a gun and shoot somebody. You should learn how to sit with your anger and figure out what you're angry about and change your life. Or another example that you see all the time, even in people who want to be good, is escalation instead of mediation and moderation. If two people are having a fight, you don't need to jump in and make it worse. you can help people to calm down and express what their grievances are and look for a solution. And that's something I know from experience. You can teach a kindergartner how to do that.
Yep.
And yet we have a society in which the majority of the people running the government and corporations don't know how to do that very well.
And then the individual rights people will complain that you're trying to train my kid, brainwash my kid with your libtard ethics. I want my kid to be a redneck. I want my kid to be a hater. Fuck that shit. I mean, those people exist. So, so an argument would be like, get the state out of here.
Yeah. Yeah.
I remember seeing a 60-minute piece like years ago about the Middle East conflict and how there was this summer camp where they would invite Israeli children and Palestinian children for the summer, and how as children they basically resolved everything.
Right? I mean, there's this weird lock-in that happens when we bless people and say, thou art now an adult and you have all the power and abilities of adulthood, where an enormous number of people say, okay, then I'm done. No more education, no more challenging my belief systems, no more wrestling with my value system. I can just go out into the world and impose whatever state of mess I am right now on as many people as I possibly can. And right. as the US elections demonstrated, it's possible to impose complete sociopathic disaster on the entire world. Under our current system, we allow that because we're not willing to admit that people are different. Right. We're all equal. We're all the same. And it would be wrong to admit that we're different. And so therefore, it's good that, that psychopaths can kill enormous numbers of people and corrupt everything. That's good because it's freedom. This is where we are.
Yep.
And the modernist worldview makes it very hard to understand what's wrong. Right. All of our language and models for how societies work and what freedom is and what's good, all of that stuff is designed to confound us from saying, well, Jesus Christ, this guy's awful. He shouldn't be president. Right. We're not allowed to say it. We're not allowed to think it. We're not allowed to reason it out. So, but freedom. Right. But equality. It's like we have all these objections that immediately rise to trip it up.
The trick is that it's very tricky, especially in the political collective government level. It's very difficult to prove or come up with the one answer that is agreeable or agree to everybody or majority. That is the tricky part, because just one example is abortion, pro-choice, for life, they both feel to their deepest heart, honestly, feel that it is correct thing. So with your own life, you can examine, as much as your life, that's completely fine and completely admirable. But at a collective social level, it is nearly impossible. And also we can just minimal level, if we can reach minimal level of agreement, peaceful agreement, that's actually an accomplishment. If you can maximize that level and have a high hope, you are destined to find the enemy, and it's just gonna get ugly, because as much as you are honest and helpful and admirable in your own mind, the other person feels exactly the same.
Right. Yeah, it's a massive problem. And what it's at the beginning of what you said, you alluded to the way that ideally what we should, we're all imperfect. We're all struggling at various levels on various things. So, ideally what we want is a society that gives us as much freedom as possible on the things that we are the least screwed up about. And on the things that we're the most screwed up about, still gives us as much freedom as we can handle. But more importantly, also surrounds us with easy opportunities to learn more, to experiment and do better, and to grow as people. And that's what we don't have, because what we have instead is a system of exploitation designed to get as much profit as possible out of people before they die, while putting as little into them as possible. Right? This system is designed for the opposite. And one of the ways that you can measure that is educational opportunities. The fact that we start charging people, and very differently from when I went to college. I mean, I don't know how many people are in tune with how bankrupting modern upper education is, but it's become a scam in which people then stay in debt for the entire rest of their lives, almost no matter what their career is. That's designed to, speaking of leashes, that's designed to put a leash on you so that there are limits to how much you can, object to the things that are going wrong in society, because you can always be yanked back on your debt. You live in sort of a perpetual state of existential threat that you're going to become homeless, or that you won't be able to afford healthcare, or it goes on and on and on. Or if you have children, now the children are under threat. The whole thing is, it's a system of extortion that's designed to keep you from doing the things that you ought to do to make a better world, including educating yourself. If we were building a society that was designed to maximize freedom, it wouldn't shout freedom, rah, the way that we do, and then tie people up in these economic chains. It would be built very differently. I mean, you can easily see that what people need, for example, if somebody has a problem with anger, and when they get angry, they hurt people and they end up in prison, what they need is not to be punished. What they need is training on how to deal with anger, on how to understand what anger is, on, all those things that are teachable for most people ought to be made available to them for free. But instead, well, they're adults, so now they have to pay for their education, or we lock them up. We sort of do this. I can profit off you as a prisoner, or I can profit off you as, as a worker. But either way, I'm going to profit off you and screw making the world a better place. This is where we find ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it always comes down to education, doesn't it? Because I mean, one of the things that I see is that even though all the problems that we have today there's so many of them, ultimately I think it comes down to that there are solutions out there.
Yeah.
But the problem is that they're all over the place, right? I mean, I know, people can get better. There's books, there's classes, there's education, there's YouTube videos, there's TED Talks, there's people with ideas. There's a lot of smart people in the world with great ideas. The problem is that it's all over the place, right? It's not kind of like, I don't know, systematized or agreed upon as a mass population, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I don't know what the answer is. Although but I am optimistic because I know we see the answers out there. Like we see them. Like you talk about free education, that's one way, right? Or you could talk about different political systems that work in other countries that maybe don't work here, but they could maybe. I don't know.
So I see that Wayne in the comments was talking about, what is the relevance of this to what was put out, and let me connect the dots, because I've been doing Kenneth reading for so long that I'm taking for granted the connections, and I guess they should be spelled out, and they go like this. Kenneth's proposing this Hegelian Greek model for understanding human beings because we're talking about three critical drives in human psychology and behavior that are different from and antagonistic to each other. And anybody who, let me take a step back. So for example, partially it comes down to motivation. So if you're a doulos, you're trapped at the level in which your feelings, your drives, your reactions, your limbic system, how things directly affect you is what looms largest in your mind. So, for example, we see this in victims of child abuse. If people have gone through terrible trauma as children, they often can't, a certain percentage of them can't develop empathy for other people because they've been too deprived. They've been too hurt. They need too much, and those needs haven't been met. And they're stuck at that level until they can process it and get their needs met and so forth. And in an exploitative system, you're going to produce a tremendous number of douloi. Because being exploited sucks, right? And so the problem is once you're stuck at that level, once you're interpreting the world in terms of, am I angry? Am I sad? Does this scare me? And these sorts of things, there are enormous limits to the sorts of decisions you're going to be able to make effectively. Much of the world can't be processed at that level. And a good counterexample of that is the Banausoi. Banausoi are smart people. Banausoi are people who can learn systems. They can learn technology. They can learn skills. They can work their way up, level after level of mastery of some complicated technical subject, whether it's finance or sculpture or programming or being a doctor or what have you. And doing that requires an ability to distance yourself from your immediate emotional reactions. So if you have been traumatized to the point that you can't create those distances, you're not going to thrive in those careers, right? You can't be a brain surgeon if you get upset when you see blood. If it makes you throw up to take a knife to somebody's brain, you're not going to be a brain surgeon. It's just the way it is. This isn't an arbitrary distinction.
Asshole.
What? Sorry, Anne, you're off mute. Okay. So let me.
She was referring to somebody in her room or something. I don't think she was directed at you, Ray.
I hope that's the case. So the theory is that by the nature of the work and mindset required to master those kinds of systems, you can't do them if you're trapped at the level of only being able to interpret the world in terms of how you feel. In fact, it can't just sit as a comfortable layer on top. It varies from profession to profession. Some professions you can be emotionally present and intellectually present. Like as a programmer, it's possible. And certainly if you've worked in an office with a lot of programmers, there's a certain amount of yelling at the keyboard. And when you're debugging your own code and you're like, you idiot, why did you write that? You can be emotionally present and still be effective as a programmer. But there are other jobs where you really have to create distance between your feelings and your thoughts. And surgeons are a classic example. Most experienced surgeons will gladly tell you about that. That they have to be able to create those distances. It's true for prison guards to a certain, if they're going to be effective at what they do, or for soldiers if they're going to stay under control under fire. Right? You see an enormous split in the behavior of Banausic soldiers and Dulic soldiers, because the ones who are there to gratify their appetites commit war crimes easily. Right? They think now I'm free and I can do what I want. And the ones who would never want to commit a war crime, but who are too jumpy, are the ones who are likely to shoot off their gun when they're startled. Right? The ones who can keep a cool head are gonna behave very differently in a wartime situation. Even if they commit a massacre, they're going to commit a massacre for very different intellectualized reasons. I had to follow orders. I had to not feel things. Their entire rationale for what happened. When people are studying psychopaths, serial killers, they talk about the difference between hot killers and cold killers. Who are the planners who could distance themselves from their appetites and think far in advance and make a plan so that they don't easily get caught? And who are the ones for whom it's a crime of passion and they're just emotionally overwhelmed and they have to act right now? All over in our society, we see the distinction in the mentalities. This is what the Greeks were talking about with douloi versus banausoi. And what they did is they took that and they systematized it to talk about, well, then how does that affect politics? How does that affect the economy? How does it affect social relations? So when the things that we're talking about, Wayne, are kind of talking about this fundamental low-level distinction between the kinds of ways that you think about the world and how that affects how it falls out into a caste system socially and economically and politically. The thing that makes an Aristos an Aristos is that, but yeah, part of it is limbic system versus prefrontal cortex, for sure. Everybody's got both of them, but the question is, can you distance yourself from your limbic system often enough to be able to spend a lot of detailed time in your prefrontal cortex? So the problem is that both of these mindsets are flawed. They're both, I mean, certainly if you've been able to struggle through being a doulos, being overwhelmed by your feelings in your limbic system, up to the level of being able to do intellectual work separated from your feelings, it's a major accomplishment and you are rightly proud of it. And it's natural that people would then say the solution to all the world's problems is to be rational and logical. It's a natural thing to say because you worked so hard to get there. And because you can look back on what it was when you used to throw tantrums when you didn't get your way and what it is now that you can keep a cool head. And you're like, man, the world is so much better that I'm not throwing a tantrum. It's natural if you're a Banausos to assume that all the world's problems can be solved coldly and intellectually. But the problem is that you can make a death camp coldly and intellectually too. And many people did. I don't know how many people have seen the interview from the Nuremberg trials. There was a camp guard. Not a guard, a camp administrator. He was put in charge of one of the camps. And when he got there, they weren't killing very many people. And he was told to make it efficient. And he's on trial at Nuremberg. And they keep telling him he did this terrible thing. And his response, documented for all of us to read throughout the rest of history, is, are you crazy? When I got there, they were so ineffectual and inefficient. Nothing was working correctly. And I fixed everything. I made everything better. And by the time I was done, we were killing people left and right. I mean, we went through so many people so efficiently. We were one of the most efficient camps. You should be giving me a medal. Swear to God, it's on the record. This is what this guy believed to his dying day when they hanged him, is that nothing could be better than making the system work, following the rules, doing it effectively, being efficient, being a professional. And we see this all around us in the world. If you watch Star Trek, classic Star Trek, you will constantly see a playoff between McCoy and Spock, where Spock is logical and he's rational and he's calm and he's able to think his way through difficult situations. And McCoy's throwing temper tantrums and yelling about this, that, or the other, right? They did that on purpose. They're like pitting these two personality types against each other. And in Star Trek, Spock is portrayed as pretty much the pinnacle of evolution. If only we could all be logical. But the problem was there were terrible people who were logical in history. Reason can lead you to terrible conclusions. The problem with reason is that it's capable of deriving valid conclusions from propositions, but it's not able to analyze propositions. Wherever it is you started, your starting configuration sort of predetermines the range of possible conclusions that you can logically reach. And many of the conclusions that we begin with in life were programmed into us when we're little kids, or that we absorb culturally and unconsciously. And that's what we reason from. I'll give you another example. I was a cardinal or a bishop, I can't remember which. It was about 15 years ago in the US on the East Coast, who was being asked about Galileo. And, was the Catholic Church sorry for what they did to Galileo? And he said, well, it might not be a popular position, but of course not. Because from the position, if you accept the logical premises of the church at that time with respect to what did people need to think in order to preserve the society as a whole, Galileo should have shut up. He was causing trouble. And you could logically prove that it was better for the world that Galileo did not put his theories out into the world than that he did. Now, it's easy to dismiss that and say, well, he's got some flaw in his logic. But as an exercise, I went back, wrote out his propositions, wrote out his reasoning, and demonstrated that it was 100% logically valid. It was. If you buy the premise, you can reach the conclusion completely coldly, rationally, and logically that he should be censored. Mm-hmm. It's terrifying because in the modern world, we have this premise that reason and logic will solve all our problems. But in fact, there's a massive direction between truth and validity. Most things that are valid are false. And many things that are true, we don't yet know how to construct a logical syllogism to make them valid. They're unrelated. Validity and truth are orthogonal to each other. I'll give you a 1/3 last example on this. And the reason I'm hitting on this so hard is because this is one of our weak spots as moderns. We're taught to admire Banausic. We're taught that reason and logic are they're like Spock. They're the pinnacle of creation. So here's a classic example. The Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition. Let's say that your premise is about love. And you want to do what is the very best for people. And that's all you want. And you accept the proposition that mortal life is short, but the afterlife is immortal. It goes on forever, for eternity. So doesn't it logically follow that it's more important to save somebody's soul than their body? Because after all, the soul is infinite and the body's finite. If you were to let somebody go to hell when you could prevent it, then no matter how nice you treated them in every other possible way in life, you are committing a crime beyond conception of infinite scale against that person. It's logical. That's just what the logic says. So from a logical perspective, you had a duty out of love to torture people to death in the hope that you could secure a deathbed confession so that you could save them for all eternity. That's the logic of the Spanish Inquisition. And there's not a flaw in it. It's completely logically sound. You can arrive at positions in which you are committing horrible acts on people's body out of completely, strictly logical, cool-headed reasons. This is the Achilles heel of intellectualism. It has no principles. It doesn't know how to examine its propositions, its a priori positions, to figure out whether it should even bother trying to derive logical consequences from those conclusions.
I would say that's the difficulty or challenge with the AI, because AI is very good at following up it's very efficient. It's very good at following up what is the most efficient way to reach the goal, but the goal, it couldn't care less about the goal itself. It can never be philosophical. It can only be efficient and just a very good tool to meet the goal or means, which it has nothing to do or no interest in at all.
Yeah. It basically turns, AI turns Banausic mentalities up to 11. It's like, now we can do this more efficiently. For good and ill, right? So
can I ask a question?
Please.
Yeah. Well, before that, I would like to quickly mention that there is 3 typology, if I'm not mistaken, by Aristotle. And basically, if I simplify it, is so let's imagine there is a piece of cake on the table and you shouldn't eat it. And there is a type of person who, because they have lack of power, they will eat it. And they don't even feel bad. There is another type of person who does not eat the cake, but they feel bad. So there is a gap between their emotional brain, and let's say, and with their critical brain. But there is another type of person, which I'm striving very hard to be that person. Of course, sometimes I fail. You have will of power not to do the bad thing. Listen, to avoid eating the cake, but you don't feel bad about it. You feel good. So there is a harmony between your emotional brain and then your critical brain. And this is amazing. The question is how we can rise up, how we can rise up to be that person in which not just he doesn't do good, but also when he avoid doing good, he feel good about it. There is a harmony between his feeling and his rational command, his rational let's say sense of duty. And this is amazing. I mean, because if there is a conflict between your emotional brain and rational brain, you may be able to avoid doing bad for a couple of times, but your will is like a battery. I mean, it's a matter of time. It will run out of energy, and then boom, you will do a bad thing. But if there's a harmony between your emotional brain and critical brain, lovely, because you will do good things automatically, because you feel good about it, and then you get charged to do good again and again and again.
Yes.
And the question is, how we can, let's say, educationally speaking, how we can have some sort of education in which we can have a character in which there is a harmony between emotional brain and critical brain. I don't know if I'm clear enough, but I'm really passionate about it.
It makes what you said makes perfect sense to me, and it can be expressed cleanly in terms of Aristotle's character typology and Kenneth Smith's typology, and it follows from the setup I did. I talked about 2 of them. I talked about the Duoloi and the Banauso, and how we can all see the differences. Nobody is a Banausos, as far as I know. I mean, there could be exceptions, except that they grew through being a doulos. Most of us have experience with the phase in our life when we are very appetitive and very driven and sort of oppressed by our feelings and sort of have to act on them. And then we get the experience with distancing yourself from the feelings. And like you say, you end up with that struggle. And dieting is a good example. You picked a good example. Dieting, it's like, I want to eat the cake. I don't think I should eat the cake, but I want to, and now I'm wrestling with it, and I'm, can I create the distance? So the thing that distinguishes Aristoi from the other 2, the reason why the 3rd type is real and not just, I mean, we can see that the first 2 mentalities are real. We have them. The reason the 3rd one is real is that it's motivated by a 3rd thing, right? It's not just about how do I feel, and it's not just about how I think. There's a 3rd kind of way to make decisions in the world, to which you would make your feelings and your ideas both be servants and neither one of them be the master, right? The defect of both of these kind of half-wit types that modernism encourages is that each one has its certain characteristic kinds of mistakes that it makes that it's vulnerable to because it can't modulate the other way. So the Banausos doesn't trust the feeling life, the emotional life. and he struggles with it, and he sees it as his enemy, even maybe sometimes. Whereas the doulos doesn't trust the Banausic life, says, you know, you have to care about things, you have to feel things, you have to experience things. You can't just think in your head all the time about right and wrong. And each of them is sort of right about the other and sort of wrong about the other in some ways. I mean, it is true that the atrocities we're able to commit scientifically and with science and technology are far greater than the atrocities we were able to commit back when, you know, there were fewer people like that and more of us were just emotional and directly involved. It takes a lot of planning, you know, to make an atom bomb, for example. I mean, that was a tremendous amount of intellectual achievement. What they're both missing is, should I do this? And not just should in a relativistic, well, this society says yes, but this society says no. And not just in a personally relativistic, well, Bob says yes, but so-and-so says no. But are there ways to make decisions about right and wrong that are independent of how we feel and how we think, to which our thoughts and our feelings really ought to contribute instead of as servants, instead of ruling? In other words, can we look into the world, whether it's the human world or the natural world outside of ourselves, and find principles that lead us toward justice and lead us toward a better world, that maybe we should leash ourselves to those principles instead of to our appetites or to our idea systems? And Aristos is somebody who thinks, yeah, there are ways to evaluate right and wrong, and people should do the right thing. We may not know what the right and wrong are. We may not agree about what the principles are, but, you know, we agree that maybe there are principles and we ought to be struggling to find out what they are and then rearranging our lives and our societies to align with them. You know? So like the whole love thy neighbor thing is an example of a principle that really caught on in history, but that you can't derive it directly from an emotional feeling life, because there's all kinds of times when loving your neighbor means doing things you don't personally like, right? Making sacrifices. And you can't derive it logically from your intellectual life either. It's a principle, the idea. And it's a principle because it affects all of our decision making. And maybe if we look around in history, we can find other principles like that we ought to be sort of aligning things with and struggling to make ourselves servants to. And if we do that, if the principles are real to us, if we can find them and care about them, then when we don't eat the cake, we might be happy about it, right? I don't need to eat the cake, but I also don't need to feel bad about it. Maybe I'm saving this cake for my wife, or maybe the way I'm living my life right now, a cake has no place in it. Maybe I'm allergic to wheat, and it would be better off if I didn't eat it, even if it tastes good. And I can feel good about that. Yay, no hives. You know, it's like there are a lot of different ways to reason your way to being happy about the decision that would otherwise look like deprivation. So, but the principal idea, that the thing that drives Aristotle, is the idea that underneath all the facts and underneath all the feelings, there's another layer to the world. That, as Heraclitus said, all of the phenomena that we see and respond to are products of something deeper that creates them. And that if we want to align ourselves with the world, we don't want to ignore our feelings. We have to see them and know what they are. We don't want to ignore our ideas and systems. We want to see them and know what they are. But the thing we really want to align ourselves to is those deeper things that generate everything. And if we do that, we'll create more just and more sustainable worlds than if we do either of the other two. And also, we'll be less likely to commit the kinds of atrocities that a hot-headed person would create, or that a cold-headed intellectual person would create. Because by aligning ourselves with the principles, we're able to critique both of those mentalities in terms that they themselves can't understand. You know, from a doulos' perspective, an Aristos is just a Banausos. It's more of those thinky people who are just always have reasons and explanations about stuff and are not paying attention to what I want and how I feel, right? So a doulos can't see an Aristos. They just look like another Banausos. And from a Banausic perspective, Aristoi don't exist because they just look like douloi. Look at you. You're not properly distanced from your emotions. You like caring about stuff and being emotional. Don't be so emotional. You should be a professional, right? You should, if you lose your temper about something in an office meeting, you're lost, right? The office meeting is structured in Banausic terms. Even if what you're losing your temper about is the fact that we shouldn't be having death camps and you should stop that right now, to a Banausos, they won because you got emotional, and that proves that you're a doulos and you should be ruled. So the idea that you can have emotions and ideas and that they should be serving a greater purpose, you know, for the good of humanity is invisible to both of those other types. It makes no sense in their terms.
But that would be what the Aristoids thinks, right?
That's what they should be thinking if they were living in a society that didn't, you know, tie them in knots and make them defeat themselves.
Right. But
The Aristoi are all mentally ill, basically,
Yeah,
in the modern world.
Is the Aristoids the philosopher who combines both the intellect and the emotions in order to make a better world?
Well, they ought to be, but the word philosopher has been so laden with meaning, right? Like
Right.
Plato's Republic, a philosopher is a different thing than it is for the other Greeks. Plato was a weird Greek. And in the modern world, a philosopher is someone who studies other philosophers and writes papers about what they said. So the idea that a philosopher should change the world, you know, you will get in trouble in a lot of philosophy departments if you set about your career that way.
So that doesn't exist anymore
It's almost impossible.
in terms of thinking of philosophy as like how to live a good life.
But they might allow you to say, well, your personal, if you want to use philosophy to make personal market choices, then modernism will perhaps allow you to do that. You know, whatever weird idiosyncratic ways you decide how to spend money, as long as you spend it, then that's fine with the system, right? But if being a better person and living a better life involves, you know, stopping the concentration camps, you know,
Yeah, that's what I'm talking
confronting
about.
ICE and all that, well, then, no, the system doesn't want you to do that, and it will do everything in its power to stop you, including put you in jail or, you know, kill you if they have to. So this is not a system. There haven't been a lot of systems that have been particularly friendly to people who come along and say, hey, did you all know you're doing this thing wrong and everything should be done differently for the good of humanity? You know, mostly systems don't like Aristoi.
Right. Okay.
But some of them are less hostile than others. In Athens, at least for a while in Athens, they tried to put the Aristoi in charge. It didn't go all that well because they inherited a tremendous amount of historical baggage, and because once they became an empire with all the funds from the other city-states to fight Persia, then they slipped into the usual things that you do where you say, Bob's an Aristos because I like Bob and I want him to be in charge, and I'm an Aristos because I want all the money. You know, the system self-corrupted.
Yeah.
A specific question that the other person asked to me seems like you are interpreting it as it's a matter of a Banausoid or Aristoid. But I'm wondering if it is not that level. I'm wondering if it is a question of level between doulos and then the next two, Banal and then Aristoid.
Douloi, Banausoi, and Aristoi.
To where maybe it has not much to do with the Banausoid and Aristoid, because it seems like, you know, for example, marshmallow or a candy test kind of situation. All there is a matter of if you're immediately relating to your physiological impulse, and then the next two levels, it doesn't even matter. It seems like it doesn't have much to do with the next two levels. It's just a matter of the first level versus the other two. And then to me, it seems like you're distinguishing between the second, Banausoid and Aristoid.
Yeah, you're right. We're stretching the example a bit in order to, we're being Procrustes right now and stretching the example to make it fit our 3-character type bed. Because it's true that most life decisions that are at that level, should I eat this nut, they don't really have necessarily a powerful ethical component nor a powerful social systemic component. It really just comes down to, did anybody else want this nut? Do I like nuts? Am I allergic to nuts? You're right. But it's when you start applying these things at the level of big social scales and justice that the 3 types fall out very differently from each other. You know, it's like Banausoi thrive in systems that have rules, predictable rules and regulations that you can follow and that you can use to decide if you're thriving or not. They like numeric metrics. So whether you're saying, did I cut this neuron at exactly the right point in the measurement of the brain, or whether you're saying, did I get out of the stock market at exactly the right point before the prices fell and therefore maximize my profit? These are the same kind of rational, logical, intellectual, numeric-oriented reasoning. And where you see the problems is when you start asking the questions that can't be expressed in Banausic terms, but that Banausic are nevertheless in charge of. Like, is it a good idea to put all immigrants into concentration camps? Like, right? Because the Banausos is better at saying, well, how would we do it? And, you know, what laws do we have to change in order to make it possible to put people in concentration camps? And how do we minimize the amount that it cost us to run and maximize the number of people that we can lock up there? And you can like do all these quantitative reasoning type analyses as a Banausos, but what you can't do is any kind of real judgment analysis. Is it immoral or unethical? Because a Banausos looks at that and says, well, that's just relative. That's just emotionalist jargon. That doesn't matter. That's not something that can be analyzed that way. It doesn't, you know, tell me what you want to do and I'll make it happen.
Not to put you on a spot or anything, but do you think the distinction, not to distinguish in a clear line or anything, but there's this tendency of analytic philosophy kind of getting close to have more to do with the Banausoid methodology versus more of a, you know, art, or let's say, you know, continental philosophy being relating to more of Aristoid type of a nature. That's what I see.
Yeah, that's Kenneth's critique of, you can see it actually in this, he talks in here, right, David? He talks about his career a bit, and he talks about the university system, and what he discovered was he went into it thinking, this is great, I'm going to get to do all this exciting thinking stuff, and it turned into just another Banausic enterprise in which the last thing in the world they wanted was somebody who was going to start throwing logic bombs at other professors and questioning the way that the economics of the university worked in tenure and all this. Like, no, they want the system to be intact, so that the people who are benefiting from the system don't have their investment threatened. You know, it's that conflict of interest thing. The moment people start getting systemically interested in something, especially if they're Banausoi, the less they want you to tinker with it, because now you're putting their investments at risk. So he found that the academia, at least at the colleges that he was at specifically, had turned into a very Banausic enterprise, and there was not much room for an Aristic approach to philosophy.
So that's challenging to any kind of a system, any institution, because Aristoid or philosophy at its core is questioning premise, and you cannot let those people just run all over in quote unquote institution.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. He's go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I know you mentioned it last week, but I was wondering, can you give a very quick example of each of those levels in modern day?
Oh, Douloi, Banausoi, and Aristoi?
Yeah, just like a couple of, just so I can get a clearer picture.
I think is what I've been saying is that there are no examples of Aristoi existing. They're eradicated. They have been exterminated. Aristoi does not exist. That's why it's so difficult to talk about this or to get people to understand what we're talking about, because it's non-existent in the modern world.
Can't you say that it is? Can we have an example of a philosophical minded philosophy enthusiast, or basically a nature of philosophy is the essence of Aristoid, because it's not meta in a big data sense, but meta in a beyond your cognition that you are kind of born in your culture way. So wouldn't you think philosophy could fit Aristoid?
Certainly philosophy was invented by and for Aristoi. There's no question, but there are plenty of ways to go wrong with philosophy, and it can, as we prove in the modern world, you can turn philosophy into a Banausic enterprise that's completely hostile to Aristoi. Nietzsche has a quote about this actually. He said, "Philosophy is only for the healthy. If you're sick, philosophy will just make you sicker. It'll give you the tools to rationalize your sickness."
I love that one. If you're sick, then anything that you have to, you know, they have you challenge you or whatever, or nihilism, you have to go through and examine nihilism and all that. That's going to make you sicker.
So there were Aristoi in ancient Greece, were they Aristoi in Middle Ages?
Yeah. They're because the Middle Ages weren't as successful as the modern era is at identifying and eradicating them all. They crop up from time to time. And, one of the key examples, if I express this in Greek terms, which is a strictly limited way to look at it. There's a much broader picture, but just as an oversimplification, let me put this in Greek terms. An Aristos would rather die than do the wrong thing. When Socrates said, I am not willing to say the words you want me to say at this trial, even though we all agree that if I don't say them, you will kill me, I would rather die. He was doing something extremely Aristic, right? That makes sense neither from a Dualic nor a Banausic perspective. The doulos is like, well, of course I'm going to say what it takes to feel better and to not be killed. Why would I not say the words? That's insane from a Dualic perspective. And from a Banausic perspective, it's like, well, where's my advantage here? Systemically, the law says I need to say this. So, even if I'm not greedy, I'm going to say it because those are the rules. And I've mastered the rules and I know how to make rules-based systems work. And I think in terms of rules. So I will say the words. Only an Aristos would say, but they're not true. And I don't care what's at stake other than the fact that this would violate this fundamental principle. And it's better that I die and serve as an example to other people of what it means to stand up for principles than that I live and betray those principles. That it's not that all Aristic situations are like that, or even most of them, but that's an example of something that clearly only an Aristos would do.
Someone like Noam Chomsky, would you consider him an Aristoi?
He certainly has Aristic qualities. I mean, in the modern world, I don't think any of us gets to be an Aristos, but you can see his willingness to put his career in danger by constantly questioning the power structures of his country and his own university and in all of academia. I mean, basically everything he depends on for his career has come under his scrutiny and been attacked directly at some time or another. That's a fairly Aristic thing to do.
I'm wondering also about Jordan Peterson too, because he's still an academic at the University of Toronto, but he's, I would say he's pretty controversial, wouldn't you say, about speaking his mind?
Maybe so. I don't know. I don't know the details of his life well enough. Okay. But what I could say about Noam Chomsky, however, is that he's a very Banausic Aristos. One of the things that Kenneth talks about is that to be an Aristos in the modern world, you have to mimic a doulos or a Banausos. You have to. Those are the only social, economic, political options made available to people. And so, for example, the way that Chomsky goes about his philosophizing is extraordinarily data-driven. He's a very, if you read like Manufacturing Consent, which granted is Edward Herman's as much as his, it's very linear. The structure is extraordinarily logical. And that's because if it wasn't that way, he'd have been torn to pieces by academia. He has to be a very Banausic Aristos in order to survive as an Aristos.
I don't know if Michel Foucault is Aristos or not, but definitely he's not Banausic.
Who's that?
Foucault.
Michel Foucault.
Oh, Foucault. Yeah.
Or those, French deconstructionists. Those, I don't know if they're Aristoids or not, but they're definitely not, to me, come across as Banausoids.
And of course, one of the things about trying to survey the field is that because of the intense pressures upon Aristoi to behave like Banausoi or Douloi, it means that for all we know, we could be surrounded by enormous numbers of potential Aristoi, because the ones that we know about are all stunted in some way. And those are the people who were able to nevertheless push through. It's like it would be very easy for most people under those pressures to never develop the capabilities that they had. And then when I say that, I also have to qualify it further and say, neither the Greeks nor Kenneth nor any of us knows whether any of this stuff is it genetic? Is it hormonal? Is it strictly nature versus nurture? Is it possible that every single human being on the planet could be an Aristos if they were given the right life opportunities and educated the right way? Or are we different ways by birth? Or is there a range of things we could become and the ranges are different for everybody? We don't know any of this stuff. And part of the reason is you can hardly even say these things in English. I mean, all the words.
And it is very dangerous, or even it's very so politically incorrect to even conceive of this at all. That's just a target right there.
Oh yeah, you can.
And my guess is, it's a potential is all there. Potential is all there, but it's probably a combination of nature and nurture, and so it just pans out in a different way. For example, like acorn is going to be an oak tree, but what kind of oak tree it's going to come out to depending on what kind of seed it was, what kind of environment it is. I think that's, in large, most people agree on that degree of it. It's somewhere in the combination of nature and nurture. But if it's just absolutely, there's no way of knowing, or it doesn't even serve any purpose in saying it's absolutely nature. Why do you need to say absolutely nature, right? Because it's a combination. Just as a human beings, it's beyond our conceivable conclusion making.
Yeah. The way I look at it is that it doesn't matter how you got there, it's what you do with it. So if we still don't know what makes an Aristoid, I think it's more important that what does the Aristoid do if they're able to. And one of the things I'm optimistic about the information age is that if you look at something like, first, would you consider Kenneth to be an Aristoid?
Oh yeah, right?
So he exists today.
Yeah, but Kenneth would agree with us that he is, like all modern Aristoi, a broken Aristos.
Okay.
He's certainly been punished economically, but also
he's impotent in communicating his message.
Well, so there's a number of issues like that. So one of them is, to even say these things, you have to use circumlocutions of speech that make it impossible for most people to want to read it. Most of us are trained to expect certain kinds of diction and vocabulary and so forth. And that diction and vocabulary in the modern world has been expunged of the capacity to express these ideas. So he has to pull in German, and he's pulling in Greek, and he's making references to other philosophers, and you have to have read their work to understand his sentence where he references them. And you end up with this chicken and egg problem where you have to already know what he's saying before you can understand what he's saying. You could get pieces of it or aspects of it without that education. But, as I've learned the hard way over the last 20 years, even a sentence that I read, in the very beginning and thought was a straightforward sentence and I knew what it meant, might even have meant the very opposite of what I thought it meant by the time I've read Nietzsche and Hegel and Heraclitus and put it all together and go, oh, shit, I had this backwards, right? So there is this question about, how effective as an Aristos can you be if you can't tell anybody else what you see in ways that they can understand or accept.
Right. The question is, does it have to be that way? In other words, does Kenneth have to use that kind of thinking, knowing that it actually maybe purposely would actually make it hard to understand? Does he have to do that? Or is it just
asking me? Absolutely. Absolutely he does.
Why?
He has to. Because he's trying to say the thing honestly. It's like he's trying to make only the most essential connections in everything that he says. But even just the bare minimum of essential connections are too many for us to stand. So one of the differences between Kenneth and my approach to talking and writing about this stuff is that I can do it from the knowing that he has already written that and said that. So I can work on creating a pedagogy, a curriculum. I can work on much simpler vocabulary and tackle much smaller pieces of it at a time and try to build connections so that people can gradually work their way to being able to understand what he's actually trying to say. Right. Now, I'm not really good at this yet, but I can work on it.
There's an argument to be made about simplicity and clarity.
Well, there is, but there's also accuracy. And so it turns out they're in conflict with each other. So if we do a division of labor and we have Kenneth out there trying to be accurate and put the full context of things that's necessary to understand them, then you can have other people working on trying to be the simplicity and clarity with while telling people at the same time, trust me, what I'm telling you is not the whole picture. It's like you're going to need to read and learn a lot of stuff to get the whole picture. And you'll know that you've got the whole picture when you can read Kenneth and go, oh yeah, that makes sense. But up until then, it's sort of like, wait, you just threw 18 new pieces of vocabulary at me in one paragraph and referenced 16 philosophers. What the hell, Kenneth? What? Right? But the thing he's talking about might really have only been properly expressed by those people using those terms, and all of the possible English substitutions we might swap in are all distortions, and not just inaccurate, but Banausic distortions designed to make it impossible to think the thoughts he's trying to help you to think. So,
okay, yeah,
I think a division of labor is called for.
Complexity and simplicity is in the eye of the beholder. If you open up the hood of your automobile, or take the case off of your computer, or look inside of a television set, and you might look at that and say, oh my God, that is so complex. That is so, how am I going? But the guy standing right next to you see, oh yeah, okay, I can see how everything's going here. Because he's got the training, he's got the background, the experience, he knows what he's doing in terms of a computer or a television set or an automobile engine, and you don't. So
right. No, I agree.
Complexity.
I agree. Well,
it depends on your background.
He knows it because he's studied it. He was able to take apart the engine and understand the purpose of each piece that put together.
Yes.
It looks complex to someone else. To him, it's simple, and that's what I'm talking about.
Yes.
There is a way, and I think you mentioned it, Rick, the pedagogy of it, to take each piece and really understanding each one.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by simplicity and clarity.
Yeah.
Together you see the big picture.
That's right. That's right. So, but I would not be able to do that if he wasn't writing what he's writing, because what would I be directing us toward? Yeah. And there's so many ways to go wrong. It's like having him as a reference allows me to say, okay, of the 16 points here, I think I can start with this one, as long as I remind my readers or viewers that I'm leaving 15 things out and you're eventually going to need them all, but let's start here. And then we'll just come back to this 15 times. Every time we add a new thing, we'll come back and say, now see, it looks different now that you take this into account, doesn't it? It's like Diogenes and the leash. Why does Kenneth talk about leashes? He's talking about Diogenes. He's saying, we need to leash ourselves. All of us need to leash ourselves because we have all these impulses and liabilities in us, and we have to keep them under control. So, but some people don't want to leash themselves. So we can either turn them loose and inflict them on everybody around us, or somebody has to help them on the things that they're not willing to do. So it takes on a very different cast when you read it in terms of Diogenes than when you read it in any other terms. Like if you read it in terms of American slavery, it's a horrific thing to say, right? It's just unconscionable. But of course, that's not how he means it. But it turns out you can write a whole book just explaining Diogenes' idea that he captures with this one metaphor. And so by being able to compress it into the one metaphor and the reference to the leash, Kenneth is able to insert an entire book into a sentence. And he does that all the time. Usually he's inserting 4 or 5 books into a sentence. But as far as what Anne's saying, he has done lectures. David and I have a lot of recorded lectures that he's done. That we've listened to and are working on transcribing. We've talked in the past about getting him to travel somewhere as a seminar, but obviously with COVID-19, that's a non-starter right now. But I think what David and I are secretly hoping is that if we do a few of these, we might lure him into showing up for one, which would be a blast, because he is a very funny guy. He laughs a lot, and he's really comfortable taking people's questions and criticisms and attacks and turning them into something fun instead of something defensive.
That's going to be, with Zoom, you have no excuse not to travel.
Yeah. So we're hoping we can ramp these up into something that we can lure him into so that we can, because it's a blast. You could throw anything at him you want. That was what he used to do in his classrooms. He would tell the administration, okay, here's my curriculum. We're going to cover these things in this order. And the administration would say, okay, I suppose that's acceptable. And then once he got in there, he'd show them the curriculum and say, now, okay, curriculum is all well and good, but what do you want to talk about? Tell me why you disagree with me. Tell me why you hate Kant. And I'll have Kant and Kierkegaard have an argument for you in front of the class. I've never experienced that. I've only read about it. So I'd really love to get him on one of these.
Were you one of his students, Rick?
No. I caught him after he'd retired.
And how did you find him?
The Comics Journal.
Oh, right. Yeah.
He was writing these widely despised columns in the very back of the Comics Journal, where he's talking about all these ethics in civilizational issues, and using the language that you're seeing in these essays to do it. People are like, "You're stupid. You use long words. I hate you." He used to they used to publish the hate mail, and he would really enjoy it. He'd write things about the hate mail, and it's like, well, even this hate mail can be incredibly philosophically illuminating. Let's look at what it is that you hate and why, and why are the reasons why somebody in the modern world would react the way that you do. And so I think it'll be fun when we get him on here.
What about you, David? How did you find him?
Well, of course, yes, the Comics Journal. I mean, that's the thing. There has to be an on-ramp. There has to be a way in, and currently there isn't any. In fact, if there is any, you're talking to them right now. We're the on-ramp. There isn't any. That's the reason for this, is to present Kenneth to other people, and I've been trying to do that for years, and I still don't have a good way of doing it. This is the best I can do. But the reason I read him is because, he certainly opened my eyes to a lot of philosophy, but just concepts that I didn't know existed. But I mean, I think I personally love what he talks about and the way he talks about it. I think he's an enjoyable read. I think he writes beautifully myself, and a lot of people disagree, but I think he's a very fun, gnomic, a playful writer. A friend I gave some of his writings to said he fences with words. I like that. Yeah, he's just a delight to read, I think. But more to that is that what he's actually saying is, I think, extraordinarily profound and insightful. But there is no real good way of presenting his stuff. One thing that is that I would mention about keeping his ideas apart from others is, I think that's partly by design. I mean, you would want to. It's like a lecturer that I know who, as soon as he's giving a talk to conservative Christians, as soon as he takes the podium, he immediately starts swearing and cursing up as much as he possibly can, and inevitably gets a bunch of people to get out. You want to clear the room of those people, like immediately, like in the first 5 minutes. Just to clear out the riffraff. And that's part of the reason why he writes the way he writes, and I think that's a good thing. Okay. I mean, do you know what 4chan is? Don't worry if you don't know. If you don't know what 4chan is, never go there. It's horrible. It's a horrible place. But it's like that for a reason. If you can get past how horrible it is, there's actually good stuff in there. But it is horrible. It's a horrible 4chan. It's a terrible place. There's a meetup group there's a philosophy meetup group that is actually titled, I believe it's in Washington, D.C. It's titled Philosophy for the 99%. I think I'm a member of that group. There's a meetup group titled Philosophy of the 99%. And I don't know if I ever have a conversation with that organizer, I would wonder why he called his group that, because from my way of thinking, that's exactly the opposite of what you want. You do not want philosophy to be for the 99%. You don't want philosophy to be for the masses. You don't want to present it in terminology that the masses, the average layperson, can understand. That's the opposite of what you want. That there's no good that's going to come of that. They're not going to understand. They're not going to like it. They're going to disagree. They're going to just create a lot of the controversy, and that's just going to waste everybody's time. I think he says it in the article that we read. He says, it just annoys the pig and it's a waste of your time.
Well, it's specifically to underscore what you're saying. By the time you have rewritten Kenneth to make sense to most people, you're now saying the opposite of what Kenneth says. Right? If you shrink it all down to the small words that have been well trod and heavily molded by modernism, you can only say modern things. You can construct, you'd end up writing sentences where you say a thing and then follow it with pages of saying, but by that I didn't actually mean this, the thing that you think I mean. And I didn't mean that other thing either. And I also didn't mean this, even though those are all the things that word means. But if I'm going to use short words, that's the only word I've got. It's just pointing every way away from the thing I'm trying to say. And so that's kind of what David's getting at there, is that the thing, Kenneth used to write in a slightly more readable fashion when I first started reading Comics Journal, he was writing Dramas of the Mind. That was the column that he was doing. And he took a break after that. Are we? Because I was going to say, he took a break after that and changed the way that he wrote. And it became harder to follow, but more accurate. And he did that on purpose because he didn't like the way that he was blurring his message by trying to make it more accessible. He was making he felt he was leading, it was leading to too many false implications. You know what I mean?
Mm.
You know, and as a writer, you're supposed to control your implications.
Yeah.
So
yeah. And I hope I'm not being misunderstood about saying that Kenneth is just too hard to understand, because that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that
he is hard.
Yeah. Well,
you'll get no disagreement from us.
My question is really more about, like, for me, I always think about motivation and purpose of things, right? So if you think about, everybody has a purpose for doing what they're doing, and so I'm always thinking about, like, okay, if Kenneth, what would be Kenneth's motivation for philosophy? And granted, I've been in groups where the philosophers are just there to just prove how smart they are.
Right.
And that's the only purpose. It's an ego-driven thing, as opposed to, for me, like the way I look at philosophy, there's a purpose to philosophy.
Yeah.
And I've always thought that it was to improve your life, improve society, improve individual, improve relationship, whatever. It's like, you know, how to live a good life. And I'm not talking materialistic.
Yeah.
And granted, people might disagree with that, and that's fine. But I'm wondering if what is Kenneth's purpose?
I can tell you.
He was writing for the Comic Journal, right? So he wanted to communicate something.
I can tell you.
Yeah.
I know what his, I'm pretty sure I know what his purpose is. So if you study Hegel, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Marx, Kafka, Dostoevsky, Hannah Arendt, Hegel, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, and a number of other philosophers, and put them all together, the synthesis that results is something very, very important to the modern world that has never been said. Right? Because you can read any one of them without the influence of the others. Sure, that's been done. And people have written books and made careers by doing that. But what hasn't been done is putting all the pieces together and using that as a lens to critique the modern world. So his assessment is that there is a next step that needs to happen in philosophy where we put those pieces together, create that lens, turn it on ourselves, and use what we see to help create some freedom for ourselves so that we have choices about where we go next. That's what he's trying to do.
That's what I'm trying to get at. Yeah.
That's what he's trying to do.
Step?
And that's why he's so obsessed with, rather than being as understandable as possible, he's trying to be as accurate as possible. So that even if not very many people understand him, the ones who can will actually get that synthesis correctly and create an accurate lens. And then it would be up to people like us to say, well, let's see if we can find other ways to explain this that will help. Now that it's been said, and we sort of see what we're talking about, let's see if there's other ways to introduce people to it.
Right. Or what to do about it, which is always my motivation with things is, I mean, I'm trying to understand something so I can then fix a problem so that our life could be better.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he's saying we need to do that, but he's not trying to tell us what the answer is. His theory is if he can design the lens, then people who follow can use the lens to figure out, okay, now what? Where do we go?
Right.
You know, David, Dramas of the Mind is good, but I actually was wondering whether I saw Anne's comment about wondering about his graphic novels and his art. And I was also thinking another thing that we haven't brought up in the past 2 weeks is his parables and paradigms and paradoxes. So I wonder if an accessible thing to do, I mean, I've got the text of Otherwise and Webb's and also Minotaur and some of the others. We could put together a Kenneth Smith parable, paradox, paradigm sampler full of small bite-sized, because those things are funny and very bitey and pokey. I could put a sampler together of those.
I'm up for that. If anybody
I wouldn't mind that. Yeah, I wouldn't mind that.
And then we could also, I could talk to him and see if we can get his permission to scan a few images, maybe from his comics or from his art, just a few, not a lot, but just a little bit to introduce people to the flavor. He is an amazing artist, which I find shocking. I'm not used to seeing people who are that good at two different things. But I visited him and got to see some of his works in progress and some of his finished ones. And I was an artist when I was a kid and in high school before I became a workaholic and dropped it all. So I know what I'm looking at. He's got amazing command over textures and light and so on. And he does a lot of science fiction and fantasy stuff. You can find some of it in heavy metal, but you can also some of his separate philosophical comics that he did have some of it too. We might be able to scan a few of those images for next time.
Go for it.
I want to just give one quote that speaks to this. Here's a quote. People who turn to philosophy expecting to harvest a crop of formulas of wisdom or understanding do not understand. Philosophy has such things, but they are merely incidental, not the essence of the matter. Philosophy is about subtilizing and tuning up the coherence and acuity of one's seeing. It is about opening new dimensions for insight, learning to think about what one is doing when one thinks, instead of just blundering through the processes of putting thoughts together.
Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. Good catch, David.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of things are side effects of the authentic things. Great wisdom to life and stuff like that is good, but it comes from, instead of just getting one quote or bite-size something habitually, especially. Yeah, for example, like happiness is not, you can't just study or aim at happiness. It's doing what you authentically supposed to do, designed to do, what so, and then happiness is a side effect or a byproduct of it, which is actually a next level goodness of it, love or friendship, all that. You don't just go out to aim at friendship. You do the friendship is a side effect of the life's authentic journey kind of thing. So philosophy is also just seeing things more clearly, and then the wisdom, life's wisdom, comes as a side effect. That's the way I feel.
I think Kenneth has said as much in some of his parables. Happiness is one of those things that you can arrive at by doing the right things. But if you try to aim at it directly, you're almost certainly going to get fool's gold instead. Because there's a whole market full of people promising to sell you happiness. So it's way too easy to go awry.
There's a lot of whatever day course and all that, and a lot of people pay for it, like happiness crash course kind of thing. It's popular modern days with the busy people, but sometimes you just have to go through the right path, through labyrinth, even all that, to be able to actually own it. If you just have it with your money or whatever crash course, memorizing happiness formula, it's just not going to give you the real.
That's right. I think Anne's right. We should add that quote to the meetup header. That's a great quote.
I think I might do that. I think one thing that people make an analogy that, well, when people say, I don't know if it's this way anymore, but it used to be said when people ask people, priests, what was your motivation to become a priest? They said, and they often talk about, it's not a choice. You don't choose the priesthood chooses you.
Yes.
It's a calling.
Yes.
You can't deny your calling. It comes from your soul. It's not an intellectual process. What motivates you, you can't do anything other than what you're going to do. It's like, and there may not be an end point. There may not be a solution. There may not be a win at the end of it. Well, but you don't fight because you think you're going to win. You fight for the purpose of the fight.
No, I agree. But I think to use that analogy with the priest, there's a difference between what prompted him to become a priest and what's their motivation for their everyday activities. In other words, and so if you ask the priest what's his motivation after he became a priest, that's what I'm talking about. So yes, philosophers may be more inclined to become philosophers and maybe trying to understand things, which I agree with Kenneth's statement there. But I think there's also the everyday, like what's the purpose of writing all these things? I mean, I know what the purpose is, you explained it. I'm just saying that I feel like there should be, okay, and now what? Kind of feeling, you know what I mean?
Maybe that's your job. I mean,
Yeah,
each of us sort of has our reactions to it,
It is,
right?
yeah.
What are we going to do now that we've been exposed to this?
And I already know that's my job in a sense. That's my reason for being here. My reason for reading philosophy is not just to be a better thinker and understand things, but also how to use that in a purposeful way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons that I enjoy Kenneth's stuff, and this goes back to something that was in the comment thread. It was JB talking about if you're referring to someone else, you're adding useless complexity in your text. Part of what Kenneth is as a philosophy teacher, even when he's writing his own stuff, he's doing so from a teaching perspective, even though it's difficult to read. And so one of the reasons to reference all these other philosophers is that they were speaking about this exact same problem. They said it before he did, so why should he take credit for what they wrote? He should tell you that this is Hegel who said this. And, then for our purposes, it means that if it turns out that somebody has some past philosopher has a critically important contribution without which Kenneth couldn't even be saying this, and I've never heard of the guy, or I didn't read that book, then as a result of reading this essay and I go through and annotate it, I go, now I need to go read that book. It's part of what's interesting about Kenneth's stuff is that it's a constant stimulus to go dig out other philosophy books and read them in order to see what they had to say. As an example, if Hegel's dialectic, right, this thesis, antithesis, synthesis, structure of the cosmos, structure of thought, structure of human nature, structure of society, if that's central to your argument, if you're not allowed to refer to Hegel and you're trying to explain something that only makes sense in terms of the synthesis, you're reduced again to writing several books to say a sentence. And so part of the power of this is it's like when you're writing poetry and you're trying to compress an enormous amount of meaning into a very small number of lines to create something profound and implicative. What I see Kenneth doing is partly philosophical poetry, although it doesn't read like it at first. It's got this enormous density of meaning in these sentences. Once you sort of see, I have to apply Nietzsche's eternal recurrence and Hegel's dialectic to this sentence to make it make sense the way that he means it. And if I do, then now I'm reading a whole other sentence, and it's just connected to all this stuff. It's integrative. It's sort of holistic and building a worldview rather than just trying to make little logical points to refute or to agree with, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. I think you hit the nail on the head when you said poetry, because poetry, right, is less is more, right? It's like you use your choice little things there that actually describe a whole world or a whole other philosophy or other philosopher that you then have to explore. So yeah. So he's a poet of philosophy.
I think so.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It certainly helps to explain why he's really not concerned with ingratiating himself to the reader. he's like it's all I can do to even say this thing.
Right. What is he doing these days?
He's doing this. These essays for last week was 2005 and another one was 2004, but he's still writing. He's writing, and David and I are following along as fast we can, trying to collect things together and hopefully get some of this stuff published again, because he reached this point where he's like, he spends all this money to get these books printed, and then he only sells a fraction of them. And now where does he keep all those things? He already has a book. His house is every philosopher's dream. It's just like packed with books. He's stood up bookcases all over the place, books upon books, upon books, upon books. And the last thing he wants to do is pack that with more of his own books. So he's leaving the problem of how does it get published to people like David and me.
Does he live in Austin?
He's back in Austin, isn't he, David?
Yeah, Austin.
Yeah.
Cool.
Someone earlier asked about why this isn't being taught in universities. Where is the education that would actually create Aristoi or awaken the Aristoi within? Where are the activist professors? And I guess Chomsky would count as someone who's an activist. And at Duke, there was a Marxism in Society program, and it got really, really popular because one of the professors there was an activist. I mean, we would meet at midnight at the coffee house and read Society of the Spectacle, and then we would drink beer and walk across the yellow lines. The idea is just psychogeography in the system. The fact that you can paint a grid and that humans will passively walk on the grid. So we had these fun exercises. He was always getting on television protesting the Iraq War. And he won the Professor of the Year award. And he was the first teaching company professor. And then students started changing their major from like pre-law and pre-med to philosophy. And then he was fired.
Whoa.
Yeah, he was fired because he was too popular and the parents complained. Because the parents want their kids to make money. I mean, that's, if you're a parent, that's what you want. So
right.
it doesn't, I mean, you're there to make money, and they were taking classes, and they felt like they were citizens. And like for example, we watched They Live in class. He thought They Live was finally a first truly Marxist film. And and Carlos Castaneda, he would end the course reading from Carlos Castaneda and playing the Jimi Hendrix's Star Spangled Banner. So it was such a great experience. Yes. So, but he got fired because he was too popular.
Yeah. In this essay, Kenneth talks about how when he finally quit at LSU, he was replaced by somebody fresh out of college with no experience at the exact same pay. Even though he'd been teaching there for all that time and always got top marks, they just did not like him. They just couldn't figure out how to get rid of him, but they wanted to. So. Yeah, it is possible now and then, if you're very lucky as an Aristos, to find some little niche where you can thrive for a while. But sooner or later, Banausic will find your niche and tear it apart. That happened to me in the VA. Well, it happened to a whole bunch of us in the VA. But we had it for a while. And so these are the sorts of things that sort of refuel you to then be able to go through the long dry spells and say, yeah, okay, maybe it sucks now and for the next God knows how many years, but you know, I'm fortified by the positive experience I had for a while, and maybe eventually I'll find the next watering hole, you know, and that'll be our thing. I got to say, these seminars so far, these two, last week and this week, for me have been hugely rewarding personally. I just love talking about this.
Would you say that, you know, I was thinking about the people who were trying to voice something and then got assassinated, like Martin Luther King and Gandhi and Malcolm X. Would they Aristoids? I would say maybe.
Maybe. I mean, you sort of have to look at each one and see what motivated them and how did they think. But certainly for Martin Luther King to stand up and say, I've been getting death threats and I'm probably not going to make it to the better world along with the rest of you, but I'm going to keep saying this anyway, is an Aristic thing to do.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Yeah.
The idea that something's more important than our appetites and more important than our systems and our profits is an Aristic idea. It's almost the defining Aristic idea. And that's why Kenneth is so contemptuous about what happens to society if you purge all your Aristoi and you only put Douloi and Banausic in charge. It's because you get people who don't believe anything's more important than they are. And that's dangerous.
Maybe I don't understand Aristotle very well in the way that you guys meant. So are you saying, is everybody on Earth, all human beings belong to one or more of these three names? Douloi, Banausic, Aristotle, everybody belong to some of these, one of those?
Kenneth's argument is that everybody, at any given moment in time, everybody falls into one of the three. And some people might fit better or worse than others, but that over time, whether you stay in the same mentality or whether you grow as a person and gain the ability to start working in other mentalities, it's going to vary from person to person.
And you're saying Aristoid is extremely, extremely rare. You're saying it's like a 0.001%, something like that. At first, I thought that it is just a temperament, but now I'm thinking more of it's more like a Ubermensch or something like that.
I think he means it temperamentally, and specifically that you're only able to operate at an Aristic level if the society around you is not constantly hostile to it. So just because you have the capacity to do it doesn't mean you ever actually get the opportunity to do it. And likewise, enormous numbers of people who never behave in an Aristic fashion. Maybe they would have in a different society that instead of suppressing them, cultivated them as people. Like, it's an open question. Is it possible that everybody could become an Aristos in a different kind of society that cultivated people, or at least massively more people? Because one of the things that Kenneth says, I think in this article, and it bears out what I read in Thucydides and elsewhere, is that in Athens, during the golden age of Athens, their impression was that about a third of them were Aristic, and about a third of them were Banausic, and about a third of them were Dulic. And even if those numbers are off by a significant amount, that's still orders of magnitude more Aristoi than we have in the modern world, as far as functioning Aristoi. I'm not talking about destiny and biology and all that. We don't know enough about that. But people who live their lives in an Aristic fashion, who put themselves at risk and try to do the right thing, Athens in theory could support something like a third, give or take 100%, which we don't. We don't. Not only don't we have 30%, we don't have 3%. We probably don't even have 0.3%. Our society is extremely hostile to Aristic functioning. Yeah. So part of what
you're saying that.
Go ahead.
If you're saying that Athens can have even 30%, to me it seems like then and modern society is less than 3%. But that means it seems like it's a genetic and very epigenetic also, that it needs, you have to have a potential, but also massively it depends on what society nurtures.
Certainly you can see the impact of society on those, because that's the biggest difference between us and ancient Greece would not necessarily be genetic, but would be from the structure of the society and what's the nurture that happens. And that's consistent with the idea that the Homeric project of ancient Greece, the Olympian project, was to try to design Greece on purpose, deliberately, their religion, their society, their politics, and everything, to try to avoid another dark age. That they set out through the Paideia initiative to conduct anthropoculture and to raise as many people towards being Aristoi as possible. I mean, under that model, according to the Athens, the perfect Athenian world would be one in which they had somehow succeeded in making everybody Aristic. And everybody could vote. Nobody had to be a slave, right? That was sort of what they were driving at. Whereas in the modern world, under not the free market, but under capitalism, which is its antithesis, we're sort of driving towards, you want to be as rich as possible. You want to be the one person who's as rich as possible. You want to have all the money. The perfect capitalist would have won, and we'd all be broke, and he'd have everything. And that sort of, even though if the market never goes that way, even if that never factually happens, that's where the arrow's pointing. It's the opposite of making everybody self-actualized and able to think at a principle, values-driven way. Could you lead to the, I see JP has a question. Could you lead to the death of all mankind but your society and be an Aristos? Not unless you blunder tragically. The whole point of being an Aristos is to do the opposite of that. The whole reason for you to exist is to sacrifice not all mankind, but yourself, if necessary, to try to push mankind further ahead and do better for people and for the world.
Well, I think I know what he's getting at, is the idea that is there ever a case where it's justifiable for mankind to go extinct?
There is an Aristic answer.
I could think of a scenario. Sure.
I think we all could.
Can you give examples?
Suppose it turns out that there's a defect in our evolution, and that we can't stop ourselves from exterminating all the life around us on the planet. Then the value equation becomes, which is more important, our one species or all the other species? Now, I don't think that's actually the case based on what I know about biology so far. But if I hypothesize it as a scenario, if it were true that the only way that humanity could survive would be at the cost of all other species on Earth, I think an Aristos would have to say, well, all the other species combined is more important than us. And then the Aristic thing to do would be to go away. But I think a better thing to do would be to get ourselves, under our own leash, so that we stop destroying all life around us on Earth, so that other species can thrive. I feel like that would be the even more Aristic answer. Is let's think about the big picture and make everything better. But David, I don't know what you may have had a different example.
Something similar. Well, something that comes to mind is something that actually came up in one of my classes. I think we were talking about ethics. We were talking about, is there ever, you usually go to cases. Well, is there ever a case where murder is justifiable? And we talk about, warfare, stuff like that. But here's one that I don't think is rarely, if ever, comes up. Is there ever a case where rape is justifiable? Is it unethical, immoral in 100% of the cases without exception? I mean, is there,
Okay.
That's an interesting question. I think we'd all say, yeah, there was. Well, I did think of an instance. What if she was the only one single female human being left alive? I mean, that was it. There was no other female human being. And for whatever reason, let's say she didn't want to. Okay.
So that's easily arguable, I think.
Well, it's debatable. I'm not saying one way or the other, but it's
let's debate it, right? So
it would be debatable.
In thinking about this, right? When you think about rape, you're thinking about consent. And if you're thinking about a hypothetical situation where a woman was the only woman in that world, she would theoretically speaking, would then consent, if we're talking about to continue procreation for mankind, let's assume, right? That's the way I'm thinking about it. Then it wouldn't be rape.
So,
or
sure, but two things. One is, I must say, I'm extremely uncomfortable with this particular hypothetical.
Well, David brought it
up. But if we go with it, how many of you have read Ursula Le Guin's short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, that is a deeply Aristic short story.
Yes.
That really confronts the question,
absolutely,
does the majority deserve to be happy if it involves oppressing a minority? What if, and she takes it all the way down to, what if everybody can be infinitely happy and they only have to oppress one person?
Right. Yeah.
And, that's the sort of question to which an Aristos is going to give a different answer than a Doulos or a Banausic.
That kind of question scenario comes up for critics being critical to utilitarianism.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Because utilitarianism gives a different answer than perhaps moral ethics ought to.
So not to bury the subject, but David, I'm assuming that was discussed in your class. I was curious what the different arguments were about this.
Well, if you could say that might be an ethical justification for the extinction of mankind. Perhaps you could argue that ethically you would have no choice but to allow mankind to go extinct under those circumstances. You could make that argument.
Right. Better not to oppress the one woman.
Or, you're
saying the woman, so if you explain that to the woman, saying, okay, mankind is gonna die unless you have sex with one of us, you would say that she would disagree.
If she continued to say no, then the ethical thing to do would be to allow mankind to go extinct.
Right.
And so in that scenario, then it would be justifiable to then have sex with her anyway, is what you're saying?
No, he's saying the opposite. It'd be justifiable for mankind to go extinct.
Well, I'm saying that's arguable.
It's arguable.
You could argue one side or the other on this.
It depends on who you adopt as your philosophical frame of reference.
I'm saying it is possible to argue both sides and take an ethically consistent position. It is possible to argue both ways.
Yeah.
Right.
As I feel with all arguments in ethics is that there's different points of view with that, right? I mean, it's like the trolley experiment, right? It's like there's no right answer, is there?
Well, what's interesting about most of these hypotheticals scenarios in philosophical ethics is that they depend upon not questioning how you got yourself into that situation to begin with. So probably by the time you've reached a condition in which there's only one woman left in the world, an enormous number of crimes have been committed. A huge mass of ethical violations leads up to this scenario, right? And it's the same with the trolley problem. You know, the whoever it is who sets up the situation wants you to stick within the frame of reference of the ethical scenario and say, no, you're not allowed to ask whether I'm a psychopath who's put this together so that somebody will die. No, that's off the table. You just have to stay inside my lines and say, what's the ethical thing to do?
Right, removing the context and then starting from there and then almost demanding an answer. And then you're just asking for totally politically incorrect answer. And then you attack the answer.
Right. Yeah. So, but yeah. So one can certainly hypothesize scenarios in which you could justify.
It's so fun to debate.
Oh, they're so much fun, right? And it's like, but sometimes uncomfortable.
So I've got to go eat lunch. So I totally missed that window of opportunity. So I'm just gonna head out. But as always, this was great and stimulating, and I hope to join you guys next time.
Sure, next week.
Next
time. Nice meeting you.
So I was thinking about fascism and the slave mentality and how tender it is and sweet it is. Nietzsche talks about this, that people do have this trusting tendency. So whenever alpha primate comes around, DNA has arranged it so that some percentage of primates will naturally accrete around the median. So find separate power and then just obey it. So all those Trump heads would be equally as comfortable with someone decent. If someone decent was in power, as long as the images of their self-concept were associated with that thing. So if you put like pigtails and freckles on like racial equality and had the right kind of music, then they would just float naturally over in that direction. They'd be very happy, and they'd be marching to make sure that blacks were treated well. These Trump people, because that's what they do. They're just mimetic. There are certain primates that are just mimetic, and they're proto-fascist.
That may well be. I'll be right back. I just step away for a sec.
Okay. Every time we talk, I always have these things going in my mind, and now, yeah, nothing. Think I might have another more interesting quote that I had set up. Okay, that's sharing right there. Now, going back to our thing about should we force people into something that they're unsuited for? Humans must, in every case, be respected for their own natural potential, but they should not be permitted to rise to degrees of power or licentiousness beyond their natural capacities for self-constraint and self-formliness. Now, this is, of course, the situation we were talking about. Why did this particular current occupant of the White House get to that position? In a culture that was working, he should have never been allowed. But of course, I would have said that about, well, practically every president, but nevertheless. The Greeks have applied character tests to qualify individuals for full or participatory citizenship. See, for instance, Milton on the Moral Quality Control Panel, the Areopagos. I mean, I'm not going to read the rest of it. I'm going to stop there. They had a system in place that would identify who would be appropriate to be placed in charge and who wouldn't. I mean, it was a coherent system, is what I'm saying. I mean, it's not about forcing something, you know, in that system, the current occupant of the White House would have never been allowed. He's just not qualified. But as I say, I would have said exactly the same thing about Obama. And for that matter, for pretty much every president of the last 100 years. I think I would, with one possible exception.
Possibly most of the ones before that.
The possible exception, I would say, would be FDR. Maybe. Possibly. I'll put this up again.
Ah. That opening clause, look at that. That's to address our fears that Kenneth and the Greeks are trying to create a caste system in the modern era. Saying, no, you have to respect people's natural potential. You have to.
No, and the reason why people like, okay, Trump, but as well as Obama and pretty much everybody should not have been placed in leadership roles is because their culture is coming from business, is coming from the law. They were lawyers, or they were business people, or they were, deep into the political machine. They were essentially Banausic. They were not, their inherent motivations was not the good of the community, the good of the commonweal. It was money, it was power, it was influence, it was corporate gains by and large. It wasn't anything towards the flourishing of the citizenry. I mean, that was the last thing on their mind. But we can talk about this guy, but I would say the same about Obama and any Democrat, Clinton before him. They're not interested in what is the best for you and me, the citizens. They're playing the same exact game of corporate power, corporate influence.
But it is all politics and those leadership positions at the very top. But that's basically, it comes down to, even before the economic system and corporate power and all that, it's basically the psychology of mass is what is resulting those limits, right? To where I'm not very optimistic if human psychology cannot change. So to a certain degree, that's just the evidence of a mass psychology.
Certainly, yeah. Trump is a symptom of something much larger going on. That's absolutely right. Yeah. When you see Democratic opposition expressed in terms of the problem is this one guy, and if we can get somebody else in office, problems will all go away. Which there's a lot of, right? I mean, that's like the dominant message right now in the Democratic campaign for president. All of that fails to explain how that one guy became president. What, did he sneak in while no one was looking and lock the doors and nobody could get him out? That's not what happened. It took the entire country to make this happen. This wasn't just about, him being foisted on people. We designed the systems the way we did because we're moderns. We have certain assumptions about what it means to be an adult, what it means to be fit for office, how governing happens, and all those things that make it hard for us to talk about. Well, that guy's just a psychopath. So why would you let somebody who thinks that way and whose character is that way be in charge? You shouldn't. Yeah, and as JB says, right, he's just the tip of an iceberg. He's just there's a whole system behind him.
Yeah, exactly. I don't spend much of my time jumping up and down and screaming about him, because he's if anything, he's just a distraction. I mean, it's not going to change anything if we elect a Democrat. I mean, that's the illusion. Nothing really changes.
Well, part of what's interesting about Trump is that his inability to keep his trap shut, his lack of inhibition, his tendency to just tweet out or blurt out whatever he's thinking, has permitted a greater degree of honesty than we normally get from a class of people who are normally very predatory, but are far more charismatic and sophisticated and self-controlled about it. It's like they're normally much better at not telling you how they're going to make money from being president, and how they are making these choices specifically for quid pro quo, so that their people who got them elected can benefit, and then they can make more money and those guys can make money. Trump will just say it, and he'll say it's good. It's fascinating. And there's this enormous opposition to Trump on that very basis. People talk about being embarrassed about Trump. That's why he shouldn't be president, because he's embarrassing. And what they mean is, it's harder to lie to myself about the nature of the US presidency when you get a president who's just blurting out the real reasons he's doing things. I want to be seduced. I want a president who is charismatic and well-spoken and will tell me all of the noble sounding reasons why he claims to do it, even though that's not a single part of the reasons why he's doing it. I want to believe.
Yeah, you can still be evil, but just make a nice message. Make a
Yeah.
nice message out of it. But Trump is giving us the id report. And that's the only good thing about him, is that he's made the id, the Republican id, which is the id, this is transparent. Alpha, domination, lust, punishment, the joy of punishment, the joy of suffering others, bombing dark-skinned foreigners. Just, we love that stuff. That's what greatness is. Greatness is watching the other people burn. And so, yeah, so it's id. His id speaks to our id.
Yeah. Ant's right. The whole, this is not good guys versus bad guys. This is two extremely compromised political parties that are part of a much larger system of modernism. And part of what's interesting about the United States from an international perspective is that most of the other European countries have more restraints on modernism. They have more traditions. They have more concern for human rights and so on. And I don't mean that they're perfect or good. I just mean they haven't flushed away as much of traditional culture and values as the United States has. We are closer to being a perfected form of nihilism. So why do they get more vacations in Europe? Why when things go bad, do the French all turn out in the streets and demonstrate and make the country ungovernable until things get fixed? And why do we all just sit at home and be depressed and allow bad things to happen over and over? It's like we're living in a more perfected, more modern society, and the more modern we get, the less good it is. Because our premises that we say that sound noble aren't actually in what's being carried out in the political and economic system. What's actually being carried out in the political economic system is really ugly.
And participating in it is being a rioter. Part of this, the Trump message now, is that even if you peacefully protest, you're a problem, and it's anti-patriotic.
Yeah.
So it's best to sit at home, be scared, and wait for the masters to decide that the famine is ended. If going out in the streets is too black, and maybe a building will be burning or someone will be stabbed, it's just they just throw that imagery up, and that's the point is to make us not like France. To take more Valium and play better video games and stay inside.
Yes, and what JB just posted is right on the money. You look at the parliamentary systems of Europe, where an enormous number of parties are able to represent an enormous number of different sometimes dramatically different perspectives, and you get more triangulation on the problems of society. In the United States, we have almost perfected modernism. We're like barely even pretending that we want to allow there to be any debate or discussion. Like the bare minimum you can do and still be pretending is 2. So that's what we have. If you were really trying to say what are all the possible solutions to any problem that we were dealing with, we'd want a parliament, because then you could get all the different parties in there representing all the different positions. But yeah. and yeah, you're always going to be able to point to China or Russia or somebody else as as being awful in some way. And the United States gets a lot of mileage out of saying, you think we're bad, you try China. But you know what? Even if China is bad, we're bad. This is not a very democratic, egalitarian society concerned with human rights that we live in. So, there's this sort of spiral of diminishing returns and diminishing expectations when we say, well, okay, at least North Korea's worse. Well, okay, at least war-torn zones where everybody's dying are worse. It's like, how low do we have to lower the bar before we can get over it and say, we're number 1? So, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, there's awful things going on in China. Absolutely. No question.
Thought about doing a political event, but I don't know. I know exactly who I'm going to get to speak if I ever do. But
all right, guys, I'm going to go get lunch. I enjoyed the conversation. Thanks.
Sure,
all right, Scott, go eat.
See you next week, maybe.
Bye.
My
So, yeah.
internet's holding up. That's good.
That's nice. I'm glad it's hanging out.
Yeah.
Oh, the Uyghurs. Yeah, minority in China. They're being rounded up in camps. They're being horrifically oppressed. It just recently came out that their organs are being sold. China's, selling Uyghur organs on the world market. There's just all kinds of horrible, horrible things going on right now in China. No question. And Uyghurs are just one of a number of different minority groups that are suffering. Absolutely. It's just, you have to know those things, and then we have to be careful not to accept the proposition that America wants us to make, that therefore it's okay what we do, because it's not that bad. I think it's okay to draw a circle in which, what both countries are doing is bad, even if one of them is worse in some ways.
Well, if nobody has any objection, perhaps we should call it a day or a week.
Yeah, call it a week. And David, should we work together, pick out parables, paradoxes, and paradigms out of his books?
I think we could do that. I had the idea that we do the Cult of Fact next week, because that's actually one that speaks directly to all the things we're talking about. I really do want to do that. That's already on the schedule. But yeah, after that, sure. We can. I'm up for that. You say you have the whole thing in digital?
Yeah, I've got both of his books in digital, and then I've also got the ones he doesn't have out yet, like Minotaur in digital.
There's that one essay in the back of Webs.
Yes, I have that.
I was looking to get that in digital, but that would be great if you got that.
I'll share it with you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, everyone. Well, thanks. I think this is continuing to be a good discussion group for Kenneth Smith. There's a lot to cover, and if we keep at it, I think it will become a lot clearer if you do keep at it. This is controversial stuff, but I think it's very it is possible to comprehend this if we keep at it. So with that, let's say until next week, everyone. Thanks for joining in.
Thank you all.
Bye, everyone.
I had a lovely time.